I'd like to call the meeting to order and welcome everyone in attendance. The committee has under consideration the estimates of the Ministry of Treasury Board and Finance for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2026. I'd ask that we go around the table and have members introduce themselves. For the record, Minister, please introduce the officials who are joining you at the table. My name is Garth Rosal, MLA for Vermilion, Lloydminster, Wainwright, and Chair of the committee. I'll start to my right.
Jackie Armstrong-Homnick, MLA for Saskatchewan-Vegreville, and good morning, everybody.
Tanny Fort McMurray, Buffalo.
Nolan Dick, Grand Prairie.
Grant Hunter, Tabor Warner.
Morning, everyone. I'm Nate Horner, MLA for Drumheller Statler, Minister of Finance, President of Treasury Board. Joining me, starting at my far left, I have Paula Bain, Assistant Deputy Minister of Economics and Fiscal Policy, Dana Hogeman, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister of Treasury Board Secretariat, Kate White, Deputy Minister of Treasury Board and Finance, and Mark Kleefeld, Assistant Deputy Minister and Senior Financial Officer for Treasury Board and Finance.
Good morning, everyone. Cord Ellingson, MLA for Calgary Foothills and Shadow Minister for Finance.
Good morning, everyone. Raki Pancholi, MLA for Edmonton Whitemud.
Good morning, everyone. MLA Rhiannon Hoyle for Edmonton South.
Good morning, Janet Aramenko, Calgary Curry.
Good morning, Gurinder Brar from Calgary Northeast.
Okay, Member Boychenko, we'll just get you to introduce yourself.
Good morning, Andrew Boychenko, Drayton Valley, Devon.
Okay. I'd like to know the following substitutions for the record. Mr. Ellingson for Member El Junaid, Ms. Pancholi for Member Calahoo Stonehouse, and Member Hoyle for Ms. Sweet as Acting Deputy Chair. A few housekeeping items to address before we turn to the business at hand. Please note the microphones are operated by Hansard staff. Committee proceedings are live streamed on the internet and broadcast on Alberta Assembly TV. The audio and video stream and transcripts of the meeting can be accessed via the Legislative Assembly website. Please note, set your cell phones and other devices to silent for the duration of the meeting. Well, members, the main estimates for the Ministry of Treasury Board and Finance shall be considered for 6 hours. Standing Order 59.01 sets out the process for consideration of main estimates in the Legislative Policy Committees. Suborder 59.01 subset 6 sets out the speaking rotation for this meeting. The speaking rotation chart is available on the committee's internal website, and hard copies have been provided to the minister's officials at the table. For each segment of the meeting, blocks of speaking time will be combined only if both the minister and the member speaking agree. If debate is exhausted prior to 6 hours, the minister's estimates are deemed to have been considered for the time allotted in the main estimates schedule, and the committee will adjourn. Should members have any questions regarding speaking times or rotations, please email or message the committee clerk about the process. With the concurrence of the committee, I will call a 5-minute break near the midpoint of the meeting. However, the 3-hour clock will continue to run. Does anyone oppose having a break? Okay, we will do that. Ministry officials who are present may, at the discretion of the minister, address the committee. Ministry officials seated in the gallery, if called upon, have access to the microphone in the gallery area and are asked to please introduce themselves for the record prior to commenting. Pages are available to deliver notes or other materials from the gallery and the table. Attendees in the gallery may not approach the table. Space permitting, opposition caucus staff may sit at the table to assist their members. However, members have a priority to sit at the table at all times. Points of order will be dealt with as they arise, and individual speaking times will be paused. However, the block of speaking time and the overall 3-hour meeting clock will continue to run. Any written materials provided in response to questions raised during the main estimates should be tabled by the minister in the assembly for the benefit of all members. Finally, the committee should have an opportunity to hear both the questions and the answers without interruption during estimate debates. Debate flows through the chair at all times, including instances when speaking time is shared between a member and a minister. I would now like to invite the Minister of Treasury Board and Finance to begin your opening comments. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. It's my pleasure to discuss the 2025 through 2028 business plan and estimates for the Ministry of Treasury Board and Finance, which encompasses the Treasury Board and Finance Department, the Public Service Commission, Communications and Public Engagement, and the agencies, boards, and commissions that report to me as Minister. As I said once, but if you'll indulge me, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to introduce those joining me at the table. Kate White, Deputy Minister of Treasury Board and Finance. Dana Hogeman, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister of Treasury Board Secretariat. Paul LeBain, Assistant Deputy Minister of Economics and Fiscal Policy. And Mark Kleefeld, Assistant Deputy Minister and Senior Financial Officer for Treasury Board and Finance. In addition to the officials joining me at the table today, I would also like to acknowledge that there are several other representatives of the ministry, government, and related entities who are in attendance in the gallery. On February 27th, I tabled a budget that meets the challenges Alberta is facing with responsible, measured choices. We continue to invest in healthcare and education. We're lowering taxes so Albertans can keep more money in their pockets. We're shoring up Alberta's economy to withstand external shocks as we face trade uncertainty and security concerns along our southern border. And we continue to support jobs to maintain Alberta's competitive advantage. I'd like to take a few minutes to provide details on each of these priorities. Our province is set to reach 5 million people in 2025, I think by July. In fact, last year Alberta added the equivalent of another Airdrie and Lethbridge to our province. While we welcome newcomers, this exceptional growth has created pressures, including in healthcare. That's why our budget decisions prioritize patients and improve service delivery with $28 billion to refocus the healthcare system and boost care across the spectrum of services. That's a $1.4 billion increase to ensure Albertans receive the care they need when and where they need it. An investment of $4.6 billion for acute care will help meet volume and costs and improve care in health facilities. To continue the work to transform continuing care, we're providing $3.8 billion to the new Assisted Living Alberta. And we're investing $1.7 billion in addiction and mental health services so people can access the supports they need to pursue recovery and wellness. Turning to another top priority of our government and Albertans, we know our education system needs more support to address enrollment pressures. In Budget 2025, almost $1.1 billion in operating funds over the next 3 years will address enrollment pressures. Budget 2025's capital plan also invests $2.6 billion over 3 years for kindergarten through grade 12 schools and infrastructure, an increase of $505 million, or 23.9% from Budget 2024. This funding will support the construction of more than 200,000 new and modernized student spaces over the next 7 years, for a total of almost 90,000 additional student spaces within the next 4 years. Alberta's government is also committed to being a good neighbor and trading partner, and part of this commitment involves taking measures to secure the Alberta-U.S. border. We're investing $29 million in 25-26 for a new interdiction patrol team within the Alberta Sheriffs. This team will tackle drug smuggling, gun trafficking, illegal border crossings, and other illegal activities along Alberta's international border. We're also investing $15 million over 2 years for 3 new vehicle inspection stations located near the border with the United States. We're also fulfilling our promise to Alberta families by introducing a new 8% income tax bracket on the first $60,000 of income. That's 2 years earlier than we promised at Budget 2024 and will help families meet the rising cost of living. Albertans and Alberta businesses pay the lowest overall taxes in the country by far, and we intend to keep it that way. And while we keep our taxes low, we're also supporting our workforce to keep our economy growing. The 3-year capital plan is $26.1 billion and is projected to support an average of 26,500 direct jobs and 12,000 indirect jobs each year through 27-28. This is $1.1 billion more than Budget 2024, or a 4.4% increase. Another $7.4 billion for post-secondary education will continue to support our commitment to developing a skilled and resilient labor force. This includes $135 million per year over the next 3 years for skilled trade programs such as apprenticeship and adult learning initiatives. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also touch upon our continued commitment to Alberta's energy sector. In this fluctuating tariff situation, we will continue to advocate for Alberta, as in North America and in markets across the world. Now I'd like to speak a bit about the 3 outcomes of Treasury Board and Finance's 2025 through 2028 business plan. Treasury Board and Finance remains committed to a strong and resilient financial foundation that maintains fiscal discipline and supports sustainable government services. Our fiscal framework is a key tool in that commitment. It helps control spending and defines how available surplus cash is allocated to improve our net financial position by paying down debt or growing the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund. It also allows for one-time initiatives that don't permanently increase government spending. The business plan also ensures policy and regulatory oversight of the financial, securities, insurance, and pension sectors is effective, fair, and in the interests of Albertans. To achieve this, the Ministry will continue to modernize the legislation, regulations, and policies in the areas for which we're responsible. In addition, we'll continue to work cooperatively with other jurisdictions to improve securities regulation in Canada, improve access to capital, and maintain a flexible and responsive provincially led regulatory system that meets the needs of Alberta market participants and investors. The Financial Services Concierge will continue to work with financial service companies and innovators to promote job creation and economic diversification. Lastly, we continue to ensure Alberta has an efficient and effective public service. Our ministry remains committed to delivering timely and client-focused human resource services. We support the development and delivery of strategic HR policy, programs, and services so the Alberta Public Service can achieve government priorities. I'd now like to provide you with some highlights from the ministry's estimates. TBF's consolidated revenue is forecast to be $31.4 billion in 25-26, a decrease from the $34.5 billion forecast for the 24-25 fiscal year. This is primarily because investment income is down by more than $2 billion, mostly due to lower returns in the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund. Revenue is expected to grow in 26-27 and 27-28, with broad-based revenue growth led primarily by income taxes. Moving on to expense, the consolidated ministry expense for 24-25 is estimated at $8.7 billion, an increase of about $3.8 billion from the 24-25 forecast. There are a few factors behind this increase, but most is due to the $4 billion contingency in 2025-2026. This contingency is reflected in my department's expenses to support communities and Albertans during natural disasters and to cover unexpected urgent in-year expense increases. Allocation of the contingency expense is ultimately reflected in the appropriate department at the end of the year. Our debt servicing costs are forecast at $2.9 billion for 2025-2026. This cost to Alberta taxpayers highlights the importance of maintaining discipline around spending, as our fiscal framework requires us to do. Our ministry's 2025 through 2028 business plan reflects our priorities for this business cycle. We remain committed to maintaining fiscal responsibility and supporting our economy by delivering on the commitments we have made to Albertans. Most of all, our government remains focused on keeping our province as the best place in Canada to live, work, and raise a family. So thank you, Chair. I think I'll leave it there. But I would just say, huge team behind me, huge team at the table, huge binder. The answers are here. 6 hours is a long time, but we will get through this. So I enjoy this process and respect the efforts of both sides of the table, and look forward to a long day.
Okay. Thank you very much, Minister. We all are as well. We will now begin the question and answer portion of the meeting. For the first 60 minutes, members of the official opposition and the minister may speak. Honorable members, you will be able to see the timer for speaking block both in the committee room and on Microsoft Teams. Which member will start? Member Ellingson, would you like to share your time?
Yes, Chair.
Okay, would that be okay?
Yes.
Okay, so you'll have 20-minute blocks and no individual can speak for 10 minutes, more than 10 minutes straight in a row. So carry on, you get 60 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I too would like to begin thanking the Minister and all those who are at the table today to support these conversations. I can certainly appreciate how much work goes into preparing the budget, never mind preparing for the conversation that we're going to have today. And it is important that we take this time to understand the contents and some of the reasonings around the decisions that are being made. And as we go through this process, just want to note that this work impacts all Albertans. And we have a duty to respect everyone, including vulnerable Albertans and our Indigenous people. We are all treaty people and have a duty to acknowledge and respect treaty. Last year, my colleague for MLA, the then MLA for Lethbridge West, noted that she sat in this seat 4 times as a minister, hearing questions, and 5 times in this seat, asking questions. I don't quite have that experience yet under my belt. This will be my second estimates, last year as the shadow for tech and innovation, and now this year as the shadow for the Minister of Finance. And I certainly hope that we'll have a cordial and exploratory conversation, allowing all of us to have a stronger understanding of how the budget is constructed, the aspects of the budget, and how it influences Albertans. We've all spent lots of time with our constituents and stakeholders, talking in one-on-one roundtables and town halls. We all know too well the struggle that Albertans have in making ends meet. Costs are rising, wages are not keeping pace. The Alberta advantage is eroding. In 2019, Albertans' average weekly earnings were $116 above the Canadian average. Today, that differential is only $60. And many Albertans aren't going to have the time to sift through that heavy binder and all of the documents that come associated with the budget. And so I'd like to take some time, Mr. Chair, to begin asking the Minister about some foundational elements in the budget. As we made reference to the fiscal framework and the Sustainable Fiscal Planning and Reporting Act, that the projected expenses should not exceed projected revenue unless the projected revenue is $1 billion below the Q3 forecast, and that expenses can only exceed revenue by the difference between the Q3 forecast and projected revenue. And this is summarized in the fiscal framework on page 14. So on page 51 of the fiscal plan, the difference between forecast and estimate is $6.55 billion, and we budgeted a $5.21 billion deficit. So there seems to be considerable room there in the fiscal framework for that deficit. Mr. Chair, on page 63 of the fiscal plan, we see the description of sensitivities in the fiscal assumptions, that each $1 change in the price of West Texas Intermediate impacts revenues by $750 million, and that each $1 change in the differential between Western Canadian Select and West Texas Intermediate is a $740 million impact. And so, through the chair to the minister, just to clarify, that the revenue forecasts are built on the numbers that we see in the chart on page 21 of the fiscal plan, also reflected as the base case on page 41 of the fiscal plan.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the question. That is correct. I don't know if you want me to get into any more detail on the sensitivities. But
in a moment.
Sure.
In a moment. Just wanted to clarify that I was going down the right path before I started asking my questions. So on page 42 of the fiscal plan, we see that the average WTI of price of all private sector forecasts is $69.50. Yet the budget assumes the base case of $68. And had the government adopted the private sector forecasts, we would receive an additional $1.125 billion in revenue. Interestingly, 2 of the 3 industry forecasts for WTI were submitted at the end of January, I think the 29th and the 31st of January. And so, through the chair to the minister, would those 2 specifically not have already factored in the proposed tariffs for the price of WTI?
They would certainly be factoring in the uncertainty that they're seeing. Yeah, and that's, we do put more weight on the ones that come in right near the end of going to print of the budget. One thing that is kind of an important thing to just clarify, industry forecasts on a calendar year, and we have to forecast on a fiscal year. So you always make that adjustment as well, and that's something that isn't really apples to apples. Mm-hmm. So you could consider the $69.50 to actually be $69 when it comes to the industry forecast when you make that change.
Yeah, understanding that that chart also shows forecasts for 2026 and for 2027, so that can be carried forward or brought into the assumptions. So thanks for that clarification. So the two forecasts from the end of January show really no discernible difference from the forecast that was given in earlier January, the industry forecast from earlier in January. I did notice, this is just a fun question, lighthearted. I noticed that the banks seem to be a little bit more skeptical than industry itself. Is that something that the minister has noted as common practice? Are typically the banks more skeptical?
I would say so, but they're also all over the place, a huge range. One of the things that's interesting in this process is we will meet and do a roundtable with the banks once a year, usually in January, to get their forecasts. We ask a lot of questions about oil because it is such a sensitivity for us. One thing that was very clear is that they have no idea. They made it very clear this year that they were more interested in what Catherine Rothrock and our team thought.
Right. So
They have
that
a good track record.
So that makes life really easy for you, that you're relying on your own estimates rather than the banks.
Well, it shows how much they value our team. Especially another thing, and I'm not trying to steal your time here, but another thing that's interesting is how much they value our predictions around GDP. Because what happens across the country is they'll make a GDP prediction for the country that makes sense, and then they'll try to work backwards and piecemeal it for each individual province.
Mm-hmm.
And so something we've seen is that they've underestimated us consistently on GDP, but it kind of builds their narrative towards where they think the country will land.
Yeah, and I'll pass on asking some questions on GDP and pursue with the oil prices,
Sure.
knowing that influences heavily our GDP. Mr. Chair, that if we notice that the differential between West Texas Intermediate and West Canadian Select is even greater. All private sector forecasts average $13.90, but the budgeted number is $17.10. Adopting the private sector forecasts would bring an additional $2.368 billion of revenue. And so interestingly, the most recent industry forecasts also show one of the narrowest differentials. The minister already noted that the more recent forecasts are the ones that are more relevant. So the government's base case is well above the highest differential forecast. And in fact, it matches the highest forecast for 2026. And so I'll ask the minister why that decision. That looks like you're being very conservative.
Well, this is what happened when we brought the tariff scenario right into our baseline. A lot of the action on oil is through the differential. So by bringing the tariff scenario right in, it affected our sensitivities on these assumptions.
But that most recent differential forecast would have already factored in tariffs, would it not?
Not really from industry, no.
Okay. So I'll just pursue just a little bit more for clarification. So if we used them around the fiscal framework, so if we'd used both the private sector forecast for WTI and for the differential, we would have brought in an additional $3.94 billion, bringing our revenue to $77.138 billion. So my question, chairs, and what I'm going towards the minister is that this brings us much closer to the boundaries of the fiscal framework. And so I'd like the minister to share a little bit about that tension between the fiscal framework and the requests from other ministries and the need to have a deficit. And I'd like to ask, I guess, is the base case built independent of those requests from the ministries, or does the request from the ministries actually play in where you fall with the base case so that we actually land within the fiscal framework?
No, the requests from the ministries are held totally separate from our revenue forecast. You know, I appreciate the question, and it's what makes forecasting in Alberta the most difficult of any province. Every finance minister, the feds will tell you that. And it's probably why we have the best team that puts the most effort and resources behind this. But when you picture the forecast, and I appreciate the way you're asking this question, I would ask it back, you know, I think Albertans, you know, the royalty roller coaster, the price of oil, how much it impacts us. The fiscal rules help us because they take some of that volatility and they tighten it up. You know, by ensuring that when you're in a cash surplus, you spend it wisely and you don't ratchet up spending beyond population growth plus inflation. It makes, when you're forced to look at things like cutting the size of government, services and programs, less dramatic as well. So it tightens up that range.
Yeah.
But I'm circling back to your point. It also, we've seen, even in my short time in this place, we've seen oil go absolutely negative. You know, you can talk about the range of industry forecasts, but the downside we own all the way to the bottom.
As Alberta's New Democrats are familiar with in 2015 as well. And so, but those forecasts and appreciating that it tightens the parameters that you're working within. The government has a history of being much more cautious than the private sector consensus. The budget documents itself note that Alberta, the government underestimated the price of oil by 2.3% last year. And so just to curious again that that the government seems to be overly cautious. Was there not any wiggle room of being less, I don't want to say dangerous, but being less cautious? The estimates are well outside of industry averages.
Well, okay, let's look at last year. So I would say we were probably more cautious, like on a percentage basis, towards industry forecast. And look what happened. We're almost exactly at, 50 cents over our predicted $74 at the beginning of last year. So I think we have to have conservative estimates because there's so much downside. I think the industry average is a great starting point for us to make some of our considerations, but you also have to look at the range of the industry forecast.
And the fiscal framework also requires a balanced budget at the end of the third year once you start forecasting deficits. And so in the third year of this budget, we are still forecasting a deficit. So it's unclear whether or not at the end of that fiscal year, whether or not we will have achieved budget balance. And so what is included in this budget that is going to take us off of that royalty roller coaster that we're really experiencing right now? And what is the plan to get us to budget to a zero balance?
Well, I'll try to answer that in two parts. You're not wrong. We're definitely still in deficit in the out years. I think that shows that the work isn't done. Not even close. You know, if oil stays in this range, the tough decisions and conversations we're gonna have to have with Albertans are just beginning. I'm not trying to say that there is a path back here. We will have to consider everything. What are the priorities? What are the fundamental principles that government needs to follow through a difficult time? How we're going to get off the roller coaster is a long-term plan. And there's no short-term plan that's been put in front of me that doesn't involve greatly increasing revenue on the backs of the taxpayer. In all the conversations I've had, you know, people want... You know, they want great public services, they want the lowest taxes, you know.
And they don't want to pay taxes.
They want all the capital, yeah. You know, I always say, I don't know how fiscally conservative Albertans are, but they're definitely tax averse.
And I have lots of questions with respect to taxes coming up, so maybe I'll take that as a segue to go back and I'll ask about...
Can I just get to the long term? Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Court, but long term, the Heritage Fund is the best strategy I've seen, but it will require great patience.
Okay.
By having reasonable assumptions, having the ability to be in cash surplus in the good years, and not blowing it. You know, if we...
And I will say, sorry, Minister, I've got 2 blocks later this afternoon scheduled just for Heritage
Okay.
Fund. So we'll get back to that too. Sorry for asking such a broad, open-ended question that kind of gets into everything. I'm curious with respect to the fiscal forecast. In the third year, there is a modest increase in expenses while we're still running a deficit. Does the fiscal framework say anything or put any boundaries on the ability to increase expenses when you're still in a deficit situation?
Well, population growth plus inflation.
Okay, so that rule still applies no matter what.
Still applies.
Yeah. Okay, and now I'd like to just ask through the chair just a little bit about like facing those U.S. tariffs. So we've already referenced a deficit of 5.2 billion, and the revenue scenario on page 41 shows that an additional 2.3 billion would be generated in the high case. So the high case, I guess a best case would assume that there would be no tariffs and that we would kind of still be operating on business as usual. But in that best case scenario, we're still forecasting a $2.9 billion deficit. Could you talk about how even in the absence of tariffs, you're still looking at a deficit?
Well, I would circle back to the population growth, and I've tried to be as transparent to the media and Albertans through this last year that we saw this coming. We have to continue to build. The capital plan is large. I may be the only one in the House that feels this way, but I'd say it's pressing being as large as it possibly could be. It's approaching labor constraints of the province. It gives me other concerns about being able to get the work done on time and on budget and not being reprofiled into the future. But we don't think it's appropriate to make those changes right now. We brought in the income tax cut. In a perfect world, I would have preferred waiting on the income tax cut till population growth settled. 4.4% is a crazy number. The economists.
I think that's a good segue, actually, because I do have a question coming into, like, that you've stated that already in the past, that you would have preferred that the population had settled and that we'd started to gain an understanding of, like, what our personal income tax revenue was going to be as that population kind of steadied.
You have that lag time. It takes time for people to come, find a job if they can. Employment's high. It's going to be high for a couple of years. We still have good employment growth, but the delta's large. So it takes maybe 18 months on average to actually find a job if you're able and start paying taxes to the point where we actually receive them and see them. So the lag time's dramatic.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And we might be able to say also with those capital costs that you're saying, where you're saying that this budget, you feel like it's a lot. I think some of us might also comment that we had already built up a bit of a deficit in capital, and that became more pressing as population expanded quickly, and that we might be facing that. So I'll transition a little bit into about the decision in the fall, Mr. Chair, to ask the minister a little bit about the decision to what the opposition was saying is de-indexing the tax brackets, like setting it at 2% rather than inflation. So we know from this budget that the inflation for 2024 was at the end of the year, the Q3 forecast was 2.9%. And not 2%, so a bit above that 2%. And the estimate for 2025-26 is 2.6%. So I'm wondering if the minister can say, what does that differential cost Albertans? So if we factor in that the brackets are not moving as quickly as maybe some people's wages are moving, that includes the basic exemption is not moving up as quickly as maybe some people's wages are moving up. What would that have cost Albertans? Do we have a kind of an estimate of an average family, what they earn, and what that bracket creep costs for the Alberta family?
Well, I'd say, circling back to the main part of your question, when that change was made, it was clear that the Premier was bothered by the fact that we had different rates across government, and it was evident in some of our programs using different years and different end months and different calculations. So when we made that choice in September to have it at 2, I think we were at 1.9 at the time for year over year in September, if memory serves. But the way that the system will work now is we'll have to make that determination in September to have the paperwork to CRA by October 15th.
Yeah, I guess with the price of oil, we've already talked about how you're factoring in many months of forecasts for the price of oil, but you took that one point in time.
I do
for
have
that
a
2%.
number for you, Court, to
Okay.
answer your specific question.
Yeah.
So the delta would be, for a single person on AISH, for example, it would be $17 less under the new approach compared to the old. A single person on income support would be $7 less. And the basic personal amount in the tax system would be worth $19.70 less.
So I asked about the average family. For this question, I asked about the average family, not about AISH or income support.
These, I only have numbers on singles, but we can figure that out.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that.
Also to note that that's a default rate, and over 30 years, for example, if it was left there, it would historically work out perfectly.
Overall, okay, I'll accept that at face value. Overall, from an aggregated revenue perspective, what would the revenue differential or delta have been had the brackets and the basic exemption moved with the overall year's inflation rate of 2.9%?
Might have to bear with us here. Ask it again while we're looking here, just so I'm.
So the aggregated revenue from the government of Alberta, like if you had used the 2.9% CPI rather than the 2% set in September, what would the delta be on the revenue for the government of Alberta?
90 million is the number we have, and most of that's from the tax side.
From personal income taxes?
Yeah.
Yeah. So 90 million of personal income taxes paid by Albertans that maybe would not have been paid if we'd set at CPI.
Yeah, I get that's true. I guess just reference it with the $1.2 billion tax cut.
Yeah.
Highest personal income
correct
tax exemption in the country.
Yeah. Apples to apples. Yeah. Thank you. So I guess I'd like to ask a few questions about the, since you had some information earlier about single income and AISH, and I just ask an aggregated question about who benefits overall from the new tax bracket that is introduced in the budget. Some details are found on page 180 of the business plan, where it states that the new bracket is for earnings up to $60,000. The new rate that applies is 8%. And that I think the number in the budget documents that it would save Albertans overall $1.4 billion annually. Was it 1.2?
I believe it's 1.2. When it was first referenced as 1.4, you have to imagine it was referenced in those years 26, 27.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And so there would have been some natural growth that would have made it more dramatic.
Thanks for that correction. We know that the full benefit accrues, I'm talking about on an individual basis, to those who earn more than $60,000 a year with no non-refundable tax credits. So with somebody with no dependent spouse or other dependents or children. So if you're a parent earning $60,000, you wouldn't receive the full benefit because you would have children as a non-refundable tax credit. If you're a recently graduated student earning less than $60,000 and you're paying interest on student loans, you also wouldn't receive the full benefit because you would have those student loans as credits. In last year's estimates, MLA Armstrong Hominack pointed out that 40% of tax filers pay no income tax. My conversations suggest this to be the case. So, Minister, those are low-income Albertans. And I guess what I'm getting at is that the benefit received, that $1.2 billion that we're talking about, doesn't spread equally in the pockets of all Albertans. And that it's maybe not fair to say that this accrues to the average family, when the real case is that the benefit accrues to above-income families, and maybe families right now that don't have children that they're claiming as dependents. So I'm, through the chair to the minister, was there more detailed research done into which Albertans benefit the most from this tax change?
Well, Well, you're not wrong. I can't help people through an income tax cut if they don't pay income tax. So I'd start there. 40% is a dramatic number. I think that should be troubling for everybody in this room, and it shows some of the challenges with our tax system and structure with the highest basic personal exemption, as we try to
I would argue
fund and
maybe
pay for everything.
show some challenges to like the percentage of our population that is earning lower than we
Certainly,
would hope that they would be earning.
It's downright scary, yeah. But I'd say one thing that came with this was the other amended pieces to make sure that nobody was made worse off. What we found as we tried to work through this policy was that if you take, it would be a very small, well, it'd be a high number if you just looked at the number, 10,000, 15,000 people, but a very small percentage of Albertans. So we made changes that also made sure that if you were a single person with, say, a disabled child and you had a lot of credits, that we made sure that an adjustment was made that you wouldn't be made worse off through this change. That was one example. But yeah, I'd say obviously you're gonna see more benefit if you at least have the full 60,000 in taxable income. If you have less, it will be less dramatic.
And I think the examples maybe through the chair, Minister, that were provided earlier, that single income earner on H, the $17 delta, was that actually referring to the tax cut in like the change for them, or was it referring to the bracket creep?
That's the delta between the 2% and the 2.9.
Okay, yeah. So I guess I will ask, in understanding that, respecting that the decision was made that no Albertan would be made worse off. But maybe the minister can share how much of the 1.2 billion is accruing to the top 10% of tax filers?
We'd have to get that for you, yeah.
Thank you. And do we know, I guess, well, maybe this, that a family living under the poverty line, do we know how much they would save?
I would just circle back to your previous question. If you picture the buckets of money in each of the tax brackets, they get significantly smaller as you move up because the mass of population is paying at the lower brackets. So that number will be quite small.
It is the, yeah, so do you, now I'll ask a little bit through the chair, Minister, about that settling out and the desire. You mentioned that at the Edmonton Chamber as well, that you would have preferred to see population growth settle out before we made changes to personal income taxes. That might also have been helpful when we're forecasting 3 years from now, and we maybe have to have really difficult conversations with Albertans. That maybe we're compounding the nature of those conversations with the decision of the tax cut today. But the tax changes aren't necessarily helping with those who are struggling the most with affordability, low-income Albertans, those who we want to make sure are no worse off. But they are worse off through another decision that was made in this budget, increasing the educational portion of property taxes by 14%. So those low-income Albertans, some of them are seniors who own their home, who will have to pay higher property taxes. Some of them are renters whose landlords are going to pass on those costs. And so I'm asking, Minister, are the decisions really made to ensure that nobody is worse off? How are we really helping low-income Albertans deal with the highest inflation in the country and costs that are putting a lot of pressures on them?
Well, just to be totally clear, it's going to go up again next year too. It's going to 33%. That's where we were historically, and that's the goal, and we'll hold fast at 33%.
So I'll ask the question again then, we already know it's going to go up next year. What are the thoughts around low-income Albertans or seniors who might not be able to pay that?
Well,
who are already barely able to pay their rent, and their rent will likely go up?
I think you have to look at those numbers and see that they're averages. Of course, you know, there is seniors deferral programs and the like for low income, but you also have to imagine what the actual value of everyone's home is. And it's a tough thing, and you see the needs in the education system. That's just the operational spend, the 33%, let alone what we're doing to build the schools.
I guess that what we will hope to see then, what we could have hoped to see in this budget and hope to see in future budgets, that maybe there's additional funding applied to those seniors' benefits and deferrals. Maybe there are additional benefits that accrue for rental and income supports for those who are unable to absorb these increases that are coming, that are meant to average out across all Albertans. Chair, and then on page 53, 153 of the fiscal plan, we see a further list of 38 items with fee increases in this budget. And these items are also affecting other Albertans. And I've heard the minister speak in the past about how when you're looking to save $1, you got to look at the nickels. So I'd just like to, some of the examples of some of those nickels. That in this year's budget, last year's budget, the fee for the Alberta Advantage Immigration Program increased from $500 to $840. In this year's budget, that fee now increases to $1,500. We want Alberta to be an attractive destination for people. How is this making us an attractive destination? Are international migrants maybe considering that when they make the choice between Alberta and British Columbia? And do we have a comparison on what that fee is, what we're charging in Alberta versus what other provinces are levying for that fee?
I don't have it in front of me, but we did make sure, so maybe just to speak about fees generally. As part of our process in considering any of these, we looked at, were they originally meant to be cost recovery or approaching cost recovery? When were they brought in? When were they changed last? On the item you're mentioning, definitely we did a jurisdictional scan to see how it compared in other provinces. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't stepping out and being. We made sure we stayed below the other provinces in this regard across the board. But I would just circle back to fees generally. If you're going to be the low tax jurisdiction, there is certain things that we're going to have to pay for, and we will have to monitor them. We'll have to see if they're approaching cost recovery, if that's their intent, and we'll have to update them. I don't think that's unreasonable.
I'm not going to disagree that we need revenue from somewhere. But I think that when we think about that, when we come back to that no Albertan is worse off, they may be made worse off through another decision somewhere else. And so that always needs to be considered. Some of those other nickels in this budget was the decision to not follow through on the promise of extended health benefits for adopted children. I think I've heard the minister reference that would be about $3 million. Maybe I'm wrong on that. I admit I don't have it from a budget document. But from last year's budget estimates, it was confirmed that about $3 million would be allocated to attracting skilled trades workers. So $3 million to $3 million. I am curious if the minister knows how many skilled trade workers were attracted through that program. Did we exhaust the $3 million? How many skilled trade workers did we bring in?
I think that specific question I'd have to defer to Minister Jones, probably at Public Accounts. He'd have that information. You're not wrong, and I like it when you say the nickels and dollars line. I think that sounds good, Cord. I like the way you deliver that.
Well, they are your words.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's why. But I would say, yeah, that's unfortunate, and that's what I tell our ministers is that, if you're going to bring in a new program, we have to make sure we can afford it for the future. It's very tough. It's very tough to cut anything. You're always impacting someone. You've increased expectation. They get used to it.
And unfortunately, I think that Minister Jones, our estimates with Minister Jones have already passed. But we can maybe find another way to ask that question. I will ask, though, this government is always talking about the Alberta Advantage, that we have the lowest taxes overall in the country. I won't deny that we need skilled trades workers, especially with the capital plan that is rolling out. We're already short of skilled trade workers. I would question on our ability to deliver on the capital plan with the skilled trade workers that we have. But given that we've always talked about our lower tax advantage, how is that not sufficient to attract those skilled trade workers? If we had 200,000 people come to this province last year, how is that not? How we were not able to capture those skilled trade workers in that 200,000?
Yeah, and I'm no doubt we did capture a lot of them, but it's quite evident that majority of the movement was simply around house pricing. As difficult as it's been for people that are renting or having their own challenges,
it's less expensive here than in other
Toronto,
provinces.
Montreal, Vancouver. It's about the delta.
Yeah. So before I hand it over to my colleague Raki Pancholi, I thought I would just end my first bout of asking questions on a fun note. That beer tax is going up, premium wine tax is going up. Those weren't included on table 153 of the fiscal plan. And I'm just curious why those things don't appear on that list of 38 things that are going up. And as an aside, I didn't see on my bingo card when I was elected that I would have so many emails, calls, and conversations with liquor stores and importers. It just so happens that Calgary's second largest independent liquor retailer is in Calgary Foothills. And there are at least 3 liquor importers that are resident in Calgary Foothills. So I just thought that that's I'll just note for them and all of those emails and phone calls that it is noticed, that those taxes are noticed, and that it is hurting businesses in my constituency and constituencies across the province. So on that note, I'll pass on re-asking that question, and I'll hand it over to my colleague, MLA Pancholi from the great constituency of Edmonton-Whitemud.
Thank you. Are you okay to continue sharing, Minister?
Yep.
Thank you. Yes, I would. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Pancholi, can I just say, just to Court's question, the reason it wasn't in that list is because it's not a fee. It is scheduled differently because it's a markup change.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I also have some businesses that have asked that question in the great constituency of Edmonton-Whitemud as well. I'll just mention that. The fun will continue, Minister, now. So I'm going to ask a few questions about the role of Treasury Board and Finance with respect to public sector compensation. The Provincial Bargaining and Compensation Office, the PBCO, rests, of course, with your ministry. The role of this office is described on page 177 of the business plan as supports the government interests as employer and funder with respect to public sector labor relations and compensation. Further, the PBCO is responsible for the government's strategic leadership and cross-sectoral coordination with respect to union and non-union compensation, research and analysis, etc. But also it says, while providing public sector employers with collective bargaining and non-union compensation directives. I think all of us in this room as elected officials have certainly been seized by the public sector bargaining that has been going on in constituencies across the province. I know I've certainly heard from many parents, teachers, education support workers, families of children with disabilities with respect to the bargaining that's happening with QP across the province. So it's raising some questions during that process as to what the role is of the PBCO and what the role is of your ministry with respect to those bargaining processes. So we are aware, of course, that PBCO plays a big role at these bargaining tables. And I'm wondering if the minister can comment through the chair, have school boards, post-secondary institutions, and others been given limitations or guidelines through the PBCO to follow as they negotiate salaries with their employees? And, for example, what role did PBCO play in the background of some of the QP negotiations, the UNA negotiations that were going on, and how much direction is PBCO providing to those employers?
No, thank you for the question. It's an interesting system. I would highlight it's one that the NDP government brought in about 2016 or 2017, and I'm thankful they did, because what we saw at that time was Alberta was greatly out of market, and that's what led to, basically a walk in the snow for 10 years of zeros and very small increases, because we had to get back to market. We're at a place now where, I'd say substantial offers have been made. Some are in the process of being, considered for ratification, and that's great news. The role is somewhat different depending who you're bargaining with. I do have a member of PBCO here if we need, but I'd say when you're dealing with, well, CUPE, for example, we don't negotiate with CUPE, the school divisions do, but we do provide support to school divisions that require it
So
at their request.
if I may, on that question of, Minister, sorry to interrupt, but it's true that you don't negotiate directly, the government of Alberta doesn't negotiate directly with CUPE. However, through the PBCO and through bargaining mandates, it's clear that the government of Alberta, and as the funder for education, does play a role in terms of setting to the employer, to school boards, what they can and cannot. Can you advise whether or not, for example, in the CUPE negotiations, was PBCO or any member of government through bargaining, having conversations at the table or, after meetings or after the bargaining table with the employer as to what they could and could not negotiate?
Absolutely, we issue directives.
So would the minister not agree then, that is bargaining with the with CUPE, with the union, if they're setting if PBCO and Treasury Board of Finance is setting the directive? Well, I guess that's a bit of a nuance, right? If you are as the funder describing, minister, to the employer, to the school boards, what they can and cannot say, you're right, it's not bargaining right at the table, but it's bargaining behind the table. Would you agree with that?
Well, would you agree that as the funder, we have to set a threshold of what we're prepared to fund?
So would it not be true then, I've heard the minister say repeatedly in public statements that this is, the CUPE has to negotiate directly with the school boards, and that, but you are setting that directive, so you are dictating the terms by which the employer can negotiate with the union?
Well, I would say across the entire public service, we issue those directives based on market, evidence-based data to ensure that we're at market. We don't want to get to a place where we're 12% over like we were in the 2010s. And that there's still quite a range. They can negotiate up to or come back for more consideration.
Would the minister then be willing to advise, either table it with this committee now or provide it at a later date, as to what were those mandates that were given and the directives, as the minister put it, that were given to the employers, given to school boards in particular in CUPE situation? What were those directives that was given by PCBO as to what the employer can negotiate?
Well, I would say this about the question you're asking. Two of the province's largest unions took their concerns about bargaining directives to the Alberta Labour Relations Board in 2021. The board determined that the directive did not alter the common course of bargaining between the parties, and that the directives have been issued in previous rounds of negotiations between the parties and are common in public sector bargaining. But we don't bargain in public.
So is that, the minister, you will not be willing to table or disclose here what those directives were?
No.
So the minister was pretty confident through the chair in saying, yes, it's completely appropriate for government to be providing those directives, but won't disclose what those directives were, despite the fact that it placed significant limitation on the ability of school boards to actually reach an agreement with CUPE.
Correct.
Okay. That's important to know, I think, for my constituents and for the many Albertans, the thousands actually, who wrote to our MLAs concerned about why their children were out of school for almost 10 weeks. And many of them did not get an appropriate education that time, and it's because government was issuing directives that they won't disclose publicly about what school boards could and could not do, which it confirms, I think, what most Albertans believe, which was that this is a result of government underfunding education and not being willing to fund it properly. So let me go back to the fiscal plan and many other portions of the budget documents, which repeatedly sort of outline that the contingency fund is going to be the place where public sector bargaining compensation will be dealt with. So would I be correct then to say, Minister, that any of the outcomes of the negotiations that are going on and the bargaining that's going on, not just with CUPE, but with you now, we anticipate more coming in the years ahead, that will not be factored into for example, the education or health budget? That's all part of the contingency fund, is that correct?
Not all of it.
Okay, can the minister then describe how much of those bargaining agreements will be part of the contingency fund, that's where it's allocated for in the budget, versus how much is going to be allocated in the budget or health?
Say a substantial portion, Ms. Pancholi, but I wouldn't have a number to give you.
So there is a $4 billion contingency fund, right, that's set out, and it's meant to encapsulate a number of things, not just, obviously, it's for wildfires, it's obviously tariffs are a big consideration, but as well it is going to be about how these collective bargaining processes settle out. So recently, and probably in the last week or so, maybe 2 weeks now, we've seen settlements in both the UNA agreement with nurses. We've seen, we're getting ratification on a number, but not all, but close to in a number of QP negotiations, both in Edmonton, Calgary, Fort McMurray, Sturgeon, Parkland, Black Gold, all of those pieces. Can you provide a breakdown for like those, for the UNA settlement? Let's start with that one. Do you have a picture of how much that one will cost, and is that coming out of the contingency fund?
A portion of it, a large portion, will be coming out of the contingency, but I don't have an exact number for you.
Would you be able to table that information?
Not till ratification, but it'll become very obvious. This is estimates, not actuals. It will become the line items of the ministry once it's paid.
So it will come out of the ministry, though, not out of the contingency fund. The reason I ask, Minister.
If it comes out of the contingency, it'll be moved and then show in the ministry's line item.
Okay, thank you. And that will happen after ratification, we'll see that?
It'll come after it's paid and the money needs to move.
So until then.
First quarter?
So until then, and I'm asking this question because the contingency fund is significant. It's $4 billion. I don't mean significant just in terms of its amount, but it's significant in terms of what it's meant to address in terms of the uncertainties and sensitivities coming forward in Alberta's, fiscal future right now. So how can we anticipate how those settlements of those agreements will impact what's remaining in the contingency fund to address things like tariffs, to address things such as wildfire preparation, all those pieces and disasters? How can we anticipate that looking at the budget now that's tabled before us, given that you're saying we won't be moving that money out of the contingency fund until a budget, it's been paid?
Yeah, well, I think you've highlighted the challenge of, projecting for a fiscal year that we're not even in yet and deals that aren't ratified. There's a lot of considerations that have to come. The $4 billion contingency is large, but we exceeded the $2 billion contingency this year. So, growing population, dealing with population growth, dealing with what I would call the unavoidable pressures in year. And then with the uncertainty of the labor negotiations and the tariff scenario. I should highlight, with the tariff scenario, my big concern, I know people want to jump and say, well, what are you going to do for this industry or that, depending on how tariffs play out. My big concern is, how do I pay for income support in the middle of the year if tariffs come in a big way and we have a lot of unemployment? It's how to deal with our statutory obligations as a government.
So I just want to come back to, it is a challenge. We acknowledge that, but you acknowledge that this year, this past fiscal year, was $2 billion in the contingency fund, which we spent in a year when we didn't have the risk of tariffs being implemented, and in a year when we were not settling significant collective bargaining disputes and ratification of new collective agreements. So some calculation must have gone into that extra $2 billion, right, that was set aside in the contingency fund. And how did you, as a minister, reach that $2 billion to cover the tariff uncertainty as well as the collective bargaining? There must have been some calculation done to decide how much of that was going to be for tariff uncertainty, how much was going to be for collective bargaining. Was there sort of an assessment gone into how you reach that number of $4 billion for contingency?
Well, definitely not an exact science. It's a very round number, obviously. We left ourselves some room, we think, to deal with the impact of the population growth that we're still working through, the tariff scenarios, collective bargaining. So we've definitely done some math behind the scenes. I'm not going to show you the napkin, but that's basically what it is.
I understand it can be complex, and I understand there's a great deal of uncertainty, but we can, as a province, eat through quite a bit with uncertainty given just wildfire disasters, right? And so tariffs are posing a significant risk in a way that has been unprecedented for our province, in an incredibly uncertain, not even just in terms of if they're happening, but how much and on what sectors. So given that, I mean, I guess, and the significant collective bargaining that's going on, I guess Albertans deserve a little bit of a certainty as to whether or not $2 billion is really an appropriate amount, or was it just a random number that was got? I'm not saying it was random. I understand there's a significant, but how do we have confidence that we have the ability to buffer ourselves against these incredible uncertainties in this fiscal year? And that's what I think I'm trying to ask, Minister, is how do we have confidence that $2 billion is enough? Or is it the right amount at all to address the incredible uncertainty that we're facing? And how can you provide that confidence to Albertans?
Well, I think it's important to just circle back to the importance of the contingency within the fiscal rules. So, you know, I'm the last person that wants to exceed the contingency within a given fiscal year and break our own fiscal rules for things that aren't true exceptions, whether that be disasters or, you know, offset revenues from federal programs. So for every aspect of the contingency, you have to come back to Treasury Board and we have that conversation about is it avoidable, is it statutory, what is this pressure doing, and should we fund it in year? So although it's not an exact science and we're weighing a lot of uncertainties, as you well stated, we think it's the appropriate number, knowing what we know and don't know, and we had to pick one.
Thank you. I'm going to turn back over to my colleague, MLA Ellingson. Before I do, just really quickly, I know the minister has indicated he won't be disclosing the directives that were provided to school boards and other employers during bargaining. Can the minister advise whether or not any of those directives changed recently in terms of what was provided to, let's say, school boards? Were those directives altered in the last, say, month to 2 months?
We don't bargain in public. I'm not going to get into that.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to turn it back over to MLA Ellingson.
Thank you. Thanks, Rocky. Thank you. So, Mr. Chair, back to the Minister. I'd like to return to some of the questions around the performance metrics found on pages 180 through 183 in the business plan. And as part of the outcome measures, the total budget increases, of course, shall be held below population and inflation. The chart on page 180 of the business plan does not include the actual estimated target, nor does it include the change in budget expenditures. If the minister could clarify Albertans just in one point, what is population plus inflation, and what is the percentage increase in spend?
Just bear with us a second. So for 24-25. So let's go to page 14 of the fiscal framework.
Yep.
So 7.3 for 24-25. So that's the growth we're allowed between the years, right?
So the growth allowed is 7.3.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then projected is 5.1 between the years 25-26 and 26-27.
Thank you for that. So it is conveniently right there in the operating expense ceiling. Thanks for pointing that out for everybody to easily find it. And so I'll ask Minister, so we do have for that outcome measure, we've already talked and heard quite a bit about like the challenges that we face through population growth and other issues. The argument about whether or not Albertans are really fiscally conservative or not, or tax allergic. But there's a bit of a delta, that the allowable is 7.3, the projected is 5.1. Wouldn't being closer to that allowable ceiling give a bit of breathing room in the budget in some areas?
Yeah, well that's a good point. So it's a ceiling, not a recommendation. It's the restraint part of the rule. But
Understood.
You do also have to consider everything we just discussed around contingency will move. So some of that is built in here as well.
I mean, the contingency is considered in the overall budget expenses, correct?
But not in operating.
But not in operating, but it is in overall. So this, the chart on page 14 is only operating?
That's only operating ceiling.
Only an operating ceiling. So does that mean that the contingency is outside of the ceiling limit?
Until it's in, do you want to comment, Kate?
Because eventually it needs to come back into the
Yeah.
ministry's expenses, right? So as an operating
Depends how
expense.
much comes in.
Yeah, so it depends how much comes in and gets absorbed into permanent ministry targets. So operating expenditure, for example, we just discussed bargaining, that will then be added into ministry targets. And that operating, will approach that operating ceiling. So some of that dry powder, if you will, is sitting in a contingency. But contingency is not counting in operating expenditure until it's allocated.
But there is probably still some understanding that the goal is not just to, drive up debt. But there is still some wiggle room in that delta between 5.1 and 7.3, even if and when the contingency moves into operating, there's still some wiggle room there. Is that correct?
Correct.
Do we know how much that wiggle room is?
But it depends how much moves as well.
Correct.
Yeah, so we'd have deals
If the
that aren't
maximum
ratified.
moved, if all of it moved, is there still wiggle room?
There's definitely wiggle room, but a number I can't give you, Cory.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could we calculate it and report it later? Yeah.
Although I don't want to get in the habit of making homework for these guys. We have 6 hours, so I'm not going to allow you to do that much, but we can figure this out.
Okay. So another outcome measure in the budget is the per capita basis that we should be lower than comparator provinces. On page 181 in the business plan, we see that in 23-24, Alberta's capital, the per capita spending was $14,162. This is well below the comparator province. I guess the $14,704 is an average, I think, between BC, Ontario, and Quebec. Is that correct?
Just catching up to you on the
That's right.
pages.
That's correct.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a difference of 3.6%. And these choices also result in Alberta falling behind in critical infrastructures, such as schools, rapidly expanding school-age population growth and the pressures there. I will ask, like the chart on page 181, it doesn't show Alberta's per capita spend this year or the comparator this year. Do we know what the differential was in 24-25?
The challenge is this is all based on Statistics Canada data, so you're always having to wait. But we will have that. Just a comment, when you're looking at British Columbia specifically, and you're talking about, room potentially and spend, I think it's important to look at, the challenge all provinces are facing, but differently. They haven't seen our population growth. Their budget this year, I watched it, mostly to feel better about us and me and Alberta. But what we're seeing in BC is going to lead to some very dramatic consequences. Their capital plan, they were already reprofiling upwards of 26 to 30%. They continue to push. They're going to accrue before the carbon tax question came up and what that meant for their revenue. They're going to take on 68.8 billion.
So I guess I will
debt.
admit to you that we are in better condition, and maybe we don't want to be in the budgetary situation that others are in. But I will ask, just in closing, 16 seconds left. It seems very awkward to me that a performance indicator, the data there is 2 years old. How can it be an adequate performance indicator when you don't know where you stand in that given year or where you'll be next year?
Okay, thank you very much. We'll maybe come back to that in the next block. That concludes the first portion of questions for the official opposition. Just make everyone aware, after this next block, we'll take our 5-minute break. And Member Johnson could introduce herself for the record.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chair. Jennifer Johnson, MLA for Lacombe-Pinoka.
Thank you very much. We will now move to 20 minutes for the government caucus. Who's speaking? Member Dick, would you like to share time?
I'd love to share time with the minister.
Okay, then go ahead.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Minister, for coming. I mean, we were only an hour in, already learned some, so thanks for doing your work and doing your homework, and thanks for the team for that too as well. I'm going to start on the business plan here. I'm jumping to page 178 here. You have this organizational chart just on what you're in charge of here. And I want to go to the box for agencies and delegated organizations. I've got a couple questions on this. Depending on all these agencies and delegated administrative organizations can have significant influence upon income for Albertans. So specifically, my first question is, would AIMCO be designated under this box for the 2025-2026 reporting period?
Thank you for the question. Maybe I'll just speak a little about AIMCO, if you don't mind. Alberta's investment agency, respected to responsibly manage more than 160 billion in assets, which includes the pension funds, Alberta Heritage Savings Trust funds, multiple endowments. Maybe I'll just speak a little bit about some of the change that we've seen. You know, rising costs, lower internal fund management efficiency at AIMCO. We felt necessitated a change. There have been significant increases in operating costs, management fees, and staffing levels at AIMCO without a corresponding increase in returns for their clients. From 2019 to 2023, AIMCO's third-party management fees had increased by 96%. Employee headcount had increased by 29%, and salary, wage, and benefit costs increased 71%. These costs had all increased while AIMCO had managed a smaller percentage of funds internally. The government is committed to improving AIMCO's operational efficiency, enhancing its risk-adjusted investment performance, and strengthening the corporation's governance practices. Recent organizational changes at AIMCO, as announced in November, are a decisive reset aimed at safeguarding the financial future of Alberta workers and taxpayers. And the measures will ensure, long-term prosperity and sustainability of public funds entrusted at AIMCO, including public pensions. A focus on cost control and internal efficiencies is central to AIMCO's strategy under its reconstituted board. And in spite of these changes, AIMCO's mandate remains unchanged, and investments will continue to be made by AIMCO at arm's length from government with a returns-first mindset.
Excellent. Thanks for explaining that, Minister. I really appreciate that. So do you have just as a follow-up on that, do you have a rough idea what the cost savings will be due to some of these actions in the near future? Do we have a cost savings or analysis of that?
Yeah, thank you. Under our new CEO, Ray Gilmore's leadership, with the guidance from its restructured board, AIMCO's revitalized operational strategy prioritizes financial prudence and streamlined internal processes. This commitment to cost reduction is evidenced by several key actions. Notably, in February of this year, AIMCO publicly announced its closure of the New York and Singapore offices, a move explicitly designed to lower overhead. Also, AIMCO is still actively engaged in long-term business and system transformation initiatives, is anticipated to yield substantial savings through reduced technology licensing, investment platforms, maintenance costs, as well as a decrease in future hiring needs due to enhanced efficiency and automation. And maybe just for everyone's benefit, consistent with Canadian public sector accounting standards, AIMCO will provide detailed financial disclosures, including expense breakdowns comparing actuals to budget and year-over-year performance. within its 2024 annual report, and that would be scheduled for publication by June 2025.
Okay, no, I appreciate that, Minister. Just continuing on, just on your key objectives, I'm gonna get off the AIMCO here for a sec, but under your key objectives, 1.1, it does state that the goal is to lessen the province's reliance on resource revenues over the long term, pay down debt, or on one-term initiatives, so that do not permanently increase government's spending. We've got an incredible energy and resource revenues and opportunity and growth there. But how are you going to reduce our reliance on resource revenues here in the next budget year, and then continue to diversify our economy going into this year? Those are really important questions that I think Albertans need some answers and clarity on.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I think it's an important one for Albertans to understand, and certainly everyone in this room. You know, Budget 24 signaled a renewed commitment by government to the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund's original principles, which prioritize sustainable growth and prudent stewardship of non-renewable resource income for future generations. This aligns with our fiscal framework introduced in Budget 2023, which mandates allocating a portion of surplus cash to savings. Recent reforms and measures taken to build and further strengthen the Heritage Fund would include, and this is maybe the most important one, the income retention. Amended legislation allows for 100% of the Heritage Fund's net earnings to be reinvested within the fund, which protects the Heritage Fund against inflation and allows all income to be compounded. Retaining investment earnings in the Heritage Fund fuels and sustains its growth over an extended period of time. New investments, government is depositing an additional $2 billion in the Heritage Fund in 24-25, representing the single largest contribution to the fund in decades. Budget 2025 announced an additional $1 billion of surplus cash to be allocated to the Heritage Fund in 25-26. So that's its portion from the fiscal year that's just ending. Revitalize growth is the next piece. The government is committed to grow the Heritage Fund to $250 billion or more by 2050. As described in the roadmap for the Heritage Fund renewal, which was publicly released on January 29th, 2025, a revitalized investment strategy will prioritize long-term asset growth using a prudent governance approach, which over time will enhance Alberta's fiscal resilience against fluctuations or declines in non-renewable resource revenues while ensuring provincial prosperity in years to come. Government actions and investment performance have increased the Heritage Fund's value to $25 billion in the latest fiscal quarter of 24-25, which is the largest amount obviously in the fund's history. The Heritage Fund has grown by $7.2 billion since 2021. And I think important for Albertans to picture what this actually looks like. By having the patience and the commitment to grow the fund to that level by 2050, you're in a place where you can pull substantial amounts of revenue from the fund in year to deal with the priorities of the province, but also replace potentially some of our non-renewable resource revenue. So currently, the last few years, it's fluctuated from 17 billion to 21 billion. Imagine by 2050, you'd be in a place where you could take, say, half of that amount and put in general revenue to fund things like healthcare and education, and be less reliant on those swings. But it will require a lot of commitment. But it's the best option I've seen put in front of me. Everything else, I know Albertans don't always understand this, but everything else means we're coming back to them to increase taxes or pull more revenue from Albertans. So it'll require some patience and some prudence, but it's a very positive step, I think.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Minister. Can you just expand upon some of the examples of the one-time initiatives, what those may include too as well? Because that's, I think, one of my questions here is just, what is a one-time, sounds more like capital spend, but I just want to be clear on that if there is something else that we might be spending on?
No, it's a good question. So part of our fiscal framework, which we've been through a little today already, involves what we're mandated to do with surplus cash, around improving our net fiscal position, either through investments in the Heritage Fund or debt repayment. There's some optionality on the Alberta Fund, the other half of the equation, and that does involve potential for one-time spends that don't increase the operational spend going forward. So there's potential that could mean capital, but it wouldn't mean capital if there's an operating expense that's going to come with it in future years. Potentially a partnership through a capital grant could be possible. Things like during COVID, one-time support payments, things of that nature. So it's important to have that flexibility, but it's the tool, the portion of the options that will be used the least.
No, I appreciate that. Part of the conversation too, and we've talked about a little bit, is the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund. Now, we talk about maximizing those earnings and also the size of which you've mentioned. So, but I just want to be clear on my understanding of these one-time initiatives. Are those, while also maximizing earnings in this reporting period, are you going to be investing in one-time initiatives through the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund? Does that add extra risk to the trust fund at all?
No, those things are separate. I wouldn't lump those together. The one-time initiatives is something the government could do with surplus cash in the Alberta Fund, but entirely separate from Heritage Fund investments.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Minister. I'm going to cede my time to, I believe, MLA Yao, and he can carry on. Thank you. Thank you, Minister.
Mr. Horner, thank you so much for all your hard work in this world of finance, and thank you and your entire team for all the great work in the budget. It's a difficult position to be in, to have to try to address all our needs, especially in our society right now. We're very, very generous, and but I mean, I have to come out of the closet here and say I'm a fiscal conservative. I am strong on balanced budgets, so you can imagine my disappointment that we have a $5 billion deficit being forecast. I find that really frustrating, to be honest. My role models are, quite honestly, people like Javier Milei from Argentina. Like, he came in there and he cut. And there's something that people might not know, is that in Argentina's 123-year history, they've only had 10 years where they've had balanced budgets. It's absolutely mind-blowing, which certainly demonstrates, when I visited there a long time ago, why it was so darn expensive. Inflation was through the roof. Like, it was just, it was a difficult place to travel through because it was so expensive. I'm a big supporter of core services, and I don't know, when you talk in cabinet, if you can convince our cabinet ministers to really reevaluate a lot of the things in their expense columns, because I hope that we can really reduce things. I recognize that, as an example, we live in a multicultural society, but and I come from a very multicultural community in Fort McMurray, believe it or not. We have a diversity that's on par with any large center, whether it be a Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver or a Calgary, Edmonton. Fort McMurray is very diverse, and we spend a lot of money. We get a lot of our community groups, a lot of grants to run their celebrations, but deep inside, I wonder if it's worth it. If we, as much as I appreciate the aspects that multiculturalism gives us, if they can't share that more from their own selves and not getting government grants to support these larger celebrations. Because to me, when I travel to other countries and people invite me into their homes and I celebrate their local customs and stuff, that's how they share their culture with me. And I wish we'd do that more here, but it's not necessarily the case. We're looking for these big celebrations that you know, that only folks from those communities wind up attending. And I don't see that diversity of the entire community coming. So that's where I'm a little bit disappointed by some of the multicultural celebrations that we have. And I truly feel that's an example where we could probably trim things back a little bit. Not to say that I don't support that aspect, but we have to be tough and we have to really look at what we're spending money on. I mean, at the municipal, the provincial, the federal level, we're nearing on 50%, if not more, in some cases, of our money being taxed. And that's absolutely mind-blowing and frustrating. Like, at some point, I'm expecting the tipping point to come and for Albertans and Canadians to get quite frustrated by all that. So I hope that we can endeavor to do better and recognize that having a financially stable jurisdiction like Alberta outweighs some of the spending that we do in other areas and enables people to really promote those things on their own.
Maybe can I chime in?
Yes, sir.
Emily, yeah. Well, I understand your frustration. So this is my second budget. I preferred the balanced one. This has definitely been a challenge. But I would ask that we all understand that we're there's great responsibility in all of these roles, you know, to provide balance to Albertans, and balance to Albertans in a time when population growth is something we've at a rate we've never experienced. Really, no one has. We have to continue to build for the future. We have to ensure that we follow our fiscal framework. I think you should sleep at night knowing that any tough decisions and questions you want to have are likely coming. You know, I think society change, things change, priorities of the province will always change. The rules will dictate that we will return to balance, and I predict that will be lead to extremely difficult conversations. But I think we should rest easy in the sense that what the fiscal rules do is they allow us to not have to react irrationally. Could I have balanced this budget? I could have, but we didn't think it prudent considering everything that was facing Albertans. So we've got a little time. We'll have to, you know, work together, weigh everything that we bring forward when it comes to programs and services, and move forward. You know, I'm happy with what the ratings agencies, banks have said about this budget, considering our population growth. They see the prudence in it. Anytime a jurisdiction brings in fiscal rules, they support you right till you break them. And so this will be the challenge Alberta faces is sticking to our principles, and it will naturally lead to very difficult conversations. But we have time. We have time to work through that. Let's see where we land with our largest trading partner to the south of us. See what that is actually, how that's actually going to impact Alberta industry and Albertans. Population growth will settle. You know, it's still a great challenge. You know, I would much rather deal with the challenges of extreme growth than stagnation and decline. And that growth is due to a lot of factors, but it's largely due, we talked about housing, but it's largely due to that this is the part of Canada that is still providing the most opportunity for investment that leads to job growth. And I'm heartened by the conversations we're seeing across the country. A lot of the things that feels like we've been preaching for a long time around interprovincial trade, but also egress and markets. You know, I'm not sure that all the premiers understood what direction the pipelines went into their province, and now they certainly do. So I think Alberta will come out of this, in my estimation, stronger than ever. It might take a little time, but I think it's our job to ensure that we help shepherd Albertans through this hard time, because that won't be the case for all individuals. So that's why the tax cut was important, even though we're even though we're in a deficit. That's why pursuing things around productivity are important. I've said this a few times, like it feels, sometimes silly to brag about Alberta being the best around productivity, because we are definitely the fastest skater on a slow team. Canada has a problem. And so I think we need to continue to be smart about how we address that, and we have to do it in real time, because things could change very quickly in the United States when it comes to investment attraction and the like.
Very much. That concludes the government member's first block of questions. We will now take our 5-minute break back at 10:40. Thank you. Yeah. Attention, we'll get started. We now move to the second round of questions and responses. The speaking rotation going forward will be the same as the first round, starting with official opposition followed by members of government caucus. However, the speaking times are now reduced to 5 minutes for duration for the consideration. Can I just grab everyone's attention, please? Option who will have 5 minutes for questions and comments, followed by a response from the minister who may speak up to 5 minutes. After both individuals have had the opportunity to speak, we will move to the next caucus for rotation. If the member and the minister agree to share time, we will proceed with 10-minute segments during which neither member or minister may speak for 5 minutes, more than 5 minutes at a stretch. Member Aramenko, are you the next speaker?
I am, thank you, but I understand there was an item that the minister wanted to follow up on first.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Just a answer to the question from Emily Ellingston around how much of the contingency could be moved into ministerial line items without exceeding the OPEX ceiling. It would be almost all of it. 3.8 billion could be moved without exceeding that threshold. So just an answer.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to share time?
Yes, please, if the minister is willing.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
You may start. Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We are all aware that Albertans are really seriously questioning the procurement practices of the government of Alberta, given some of the very serious allegations made by the CEO, former CEO of AHS. The budget contains billions, Minister, in infrastructure projects, from education, advanced education, health, mental health and addiction, and more. Excuse me. Right at the top of the ministry's mandate and structure information on page 177 of the business plan, we see that Treasury Board and Finance has responsibility for budget planning, financial management, and economic analysis across the government of Alberta. Through the chair, does the ministry have a role to play in ensuring that funds are used efficiently? Does the ministry provide advice or analysis to other ministries in assessment and analysis of contracts that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars?
Thank you, through the chair. Yes, we certainly do have a role to play, and we certainly give analysis, and maybe I'll try to give a little background of the role we play. Just bear with me. It's a little complicated. I'll try to give you the breakdown.
Thank you. Maybe while you're looking, if I may add another element to that question so that we can get that answered all at the same time. Is an element of your advice or service provision, does it include an analysis of understanding private sector versus public sector delivery when it comes to the actual ownership of assets, the benefit accrued as a result of that operation in the long term to whether it be to the ministry specifically, the government overall, and to Albertans generally?
Yes, certainly. Like when we're looking at analysis, if we're looking at the potential for a capital project, let's say that there's analysis on what this looks like if it's a design bid build, if this is a P3 We're gonna have that interaction between the other ministries, make sure that there's value for money and that everything's, being considered, and that the economic analysis that they're showing, that we don't have questions, that there isn't things that look off. So we're constantly doing that math to ensure there's value for money throughout the two different roles. Did you want to read that? So this will give you a little bit as to our role in procurement. So in terms of my role as President of the Treasury Board and Minister of Finance, my department provides guidance and direction across government through Treasury Board directives. An example would be the Procurement and Sole Sourcing Directive, which requires departments to foster consistent government-wide practices in the procurement of goods and services, including in respect of construction, and limits the authority of departments to sole source in respect of services and construction. Under this directive, the Department of Service Alberta and Red Tape Reduction is responsible for establishing the procurement accountability framework that all departments must participate in. My department also provides internal audit services across government, focusing on areas of risk, potential for fraud, to assist departments in achieving their objectives. In addition, as part of the process for internal controls over financial reporting, my department is informed of all potential fraud cases that may arise during the year to support the year-end consolidated financial statement reporting process. And my department also provides guidance and shares information to the finance community regarding potential areas of fraud, enabling them to identify and mitigate them.
And so is the request for your service and feedback voluntary, or is there a particular threshold where a ministry must come, or a department of a ministry must come to TBF to say, does this kind of pass the sniff test?
They certainly are obligated to come to us,
Okay.
but it can work the other way as well.
Is there a particular threshold under which they are not obligated?
There's several.
I'm gonna let my deputy minister comment,
Sure,
if that's
thank
right.
you.
So there's several thresholds in the procurement policy. So $10,000 sole source, $75,000 invitational bid, and many permutations under that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's for both capital and other granting agreements or contracts? Operating?
Almost all capital is going to require a formal approval
Sure,
just because
with
of the
that,
size. Yeah.
It's so much bigger. Okay, thank you so much. Somewhat aligned with that then, through the chair, Minister, you've already expressed some concern this morning about the capital spend that is getting very close in this budget to exceeding our labor capacity and possibly even our fiscal capacity as well. Capital commitments across the health system, including new health organizations of Recovery Alberta and Continuing Care, have really snowballed. Of course, as I mentioned, we've heard some very serious allegations to some of the contracting services in regards to those particular departments. Have you expressed that concern around capital spend through the Treasury Board directives that you've alluded to in regards to your guidance around the total capital spend?
Well, so like we are bound by the Infrastructure Accountability Act. So those conversations, as we're in Treasury Board deliberations, are always brought up first as a reference point for all conversations. But definitely, I'm glad you mentioned it, because I do have concern over the overall size of the capital plan. And the bigger the plan, the bigger the reprofiling. There's also concerns not only with the labor ceiling in the province and our ability to complete these things, but there's also the concern of potential for cost escalation through a lot of this uncertainty. And with tariffs, the tariffs' potential to impact in different ways, it's going to be very important to watch how this year plays out.
Okay.
I don't want to be in a position where we have a snowball of reprofiling, Because the easiest way I can explain that is that for any of you that, you know, you want a school and you want a road, you know, if we have more things in the plan that aren't being completed, it's displacing things that potentially could be. So I think we'll have to really do analysis on if we do see major reprofiling in what sectors and end on cost escalation.
Okay, thank you. My goodness, a 10-minute block goes very quickly. Thank you so much for such thorough answers, though. I think you've really answered those clearly for me. A little bit on what my colleague was mentioning in regards to the performance measures. Performance measure 3.A on page 183 of the business plan is the ratio of provincial public administration employees per 1,000 residents. It only goes to 2023. Perhaps that's because of some of the stats can things that you've mentioned already in terms of lag, but I'd like some clarity on why it stops at 2023, and there's actually no target figures there. For 2023, Alberta had 5.9 employees per 1,000 population, while the average for comparator provinces is quite a bit higher at 7.7. This feels like a measurement of output, Minister, through the chair, not outcome. All it seems to tell me is an ideological fidelity to prioritize private over public without actually demonstrating what it is delivering of greater value and how it serves the interests of Albertans. And so please, in the minute that I've got left here, in regards to that measure, how is this a measure in service to Albertans? And through the chair, what would the minister like that number to be in 3 years?
No, it's a good question. So I would call it more of a measure of efficiency. The best number I have, and I just had this conversation with PCS, is the 5.9, and some of that will have to get caught up with data. But I think it's important. See, we want to ensure that the public service is right-sized. I think there's other ways that potentially we're going to assess the outcome of what's coming out the other end, so to speak. But this is a great guidepost for efficiency and comparing to the other provinces. The only province that is below us, and this is maybe an old number, but it's the one that's in my head, is 5.4% for Ontario. And I think it would probably be dangerous for us to chase that just because of their size and economies of scale.
So do you have a target?
My target is to be below everyone and above Ontario.
Okay, thank you very much. Something I forgot to mention last time, you won't be able to cede time. So everyone, if you run out of questions, we'll just go over to the other caucus. So our next speaker is Member Yao. Go ahead. And the other part, I'm going to assume that we're going to share time throughout our blocks here. If that changes, Minister, just if you want to go to block for some reason, feel free to do that. But I'm going to assume that we're going to share time. Okay, go ahead.
Minister, in 1A of the performance measures on page 180 of the Ministry Business Plan, you talk about the Alberta fiscal framework limiting the growth of in-year spending to a budgeted and voted contingency and keeping year-over-year operating spending at or below the forecasted rate of Alberta's population growth plus inflation. When I read statements like that, that's music to my ears that we are striving to get those balanced budgets and any increases are done with a reasonable science in there. So with that in mind, I also understand why you have to have contingencies and things like that, because we have natural disasters. We have our neighbor to the south who's threatening tariffs on us. I'm wondering how do you is that a realistic goal for 25-26 reporting period, considering the number of natural disasters we have in Alberta? We're at this epicenter for some reason. Being from Fort McMurray, I've been hit by fire and flood. I have gotten through those unscathed. However, my colleague from Fort McMurray, Lac La Biche, got absolutely hammered both times. It was absolutely mind-blowing, his luck. But that said, lots of people got hurt by those, and again, the how the province, quite honestly, goes above and beyond in supporting people who should have things like insurance, private insurance, is really really demonstrates the generosity of our province and the fact that we really are in a better position than most areas to be able to provide those kind of supports. Like I was reading an article in the Philippines, they had some mudslide and hundreds of people died, entire villages were wiped out. They don't give anyone money there. There's not a dollar that's allocated for that sort of thing. I went to Uruguay in my younger days, and Uruguay, with the city of Montevideo, I found out they have 1 month a year where they are the tourist capital of South America, and anyone who is anyone goes there to enjoy their beaches and stuff because they have 1 month of good weather there. And I'm talking to the locals, and they're saying that's the 1 month they have to make money because of the rest of the year, the other 11 months, they're going to get nothing, very minimal money. And they don't have a social security net the way we do. They have to save that money and get it through the rest of the year. So that said, I do recognize why you have to do some of these adjustments and recognize and prepare for such things like the tariff threats, like the natural disasters. Can you explain to me more about that process?
No, thank you for the question. So I think when you're thinking about the fiscal rules and how they apply, I picture them somewhat like a straitjacket, and you never know which part of the jacket's restraining you in a given fiscal year. It might be the contingency, it might be the OPEX ceiling, it might be the no deficit requirement without exception. So every year is different. So this year the contingency being raised is a big part of how we expect to stay within the fiscal rules. OPEX ceiling is important, especially with the population growth changes that we're seeing and will expect in the future. But that's part of why the rules are pretty rigid in that sense, but also flexible and practical. So wildfire disasters are an exception that's allowed to the contingency rules. If we must pull wildfire spend out of that, we can. I would hope that it's always our hope going into a fiscal year that we can keep it within, but that may not always be the case. We'll have supplemental estimates, I think, on Monday, and that will be because we exceeded the $2 billion. So we can get into that shortly. But a large portion of that was from wildfire this year, Jasper response, and ongoing drought concerns and our obligations through our indemnities with crop insurance and the like. So there is flexibility in that sense that we'll always be able to respond to those really unpreventable disaster scenarios. But hopefully we're due for a year where we can stay within the contingency and address them there.
Thank you so much, Minister. Through the chair, the performance measures 1B located on 181 of the business plan. It states that the per capita expenditure comparisons used are Quebec, Ontario, and BC. And I recognize those are more equivalent to Alberta in regards to population and stuff like that. But, I mean, they have different economies. Like, Quebec seems to be totally reliant on our government. And they get some money off the hydro, definitely. But, I mean, like, we're the only ones that have an industry that is lucrative but is being attacked by a federal government. We don't, like, you don't see the auto sector getting hammered by the feds in Ontario. You don't see the lumber industry getting overly hurt by the federal government's actions in BC, but I mean, and these things are ultimately things that really affect our bottom line and performance. Is it fair that we use these provinces as a comparison? Is there any other ways that we can do this? I guess I'm referring to like the per capita expenditures. Can you give us an insight as to how we use these measures and how you anticipate we can outperform these provinces moving forward.
Well, I think these things are important in the sense that they give you some anchors and some guidance. You see what's happening around you, and you see where you fit in it. I'm the last person that wants to spend more because everyone else is if the outcomes are good in that sector. I think that's silly. That shouldn't be a goal. But if we're overspending in a sector, you know, like let's look at healthcare. Healthcare, you know, we spend more per capita, and we have the youngest population. That's something that I think we can ask questions about how we're getting there. Education is different. We're spending less on education. The outcomes are still comparatively good. We know that we need to spend more and will and have challenges with population growth. But I think all of those things they give you some guidance and a place to start, and then you ask more questions. We want people to have things get more expensive too, and that happens across the board for all the provinces. You're going to want diagnostic imaging whether you're in Saskatchewan or you're in Alberta or you're in the Maritimes, and people are living longer, and it's a lot of those things are applicable across the board, and they give us a reference point to say where do we sit and where can we look to do better, where we're doing well, and it's part of the tools to work on our priorities and spending going forward. So you're looking backwards, you get a reference point, and it gives you just a little bit more information as you make your next decision.
I see. Well, again, Mr. I do appreciate your hard work and that of your entire team. I would ask that in the upcoming budgets that maybe you say no a little bit more. I know we contradict ourselves. We're telling you to get the balanced budgets, but then I'm asking for money to support some like a recovery center in Fort McMurray, or help with a housing project there, or more money for my hospital so that we can attract more orthopedic surgeons, and it's an ongoing thing. So I can't express enough how I really feel that our government needs to be a little bit more aggressive in cutting some costs, looking at really just supporting and providing core services, maybe whittling out some of the little things that are nice to have but not necessary. I could point to some things in some ministries like health, an example, that we're providing services that no other province provides. It's mind-blowing, and it costs money, and every little bit just adds up to the point where we're just we're in a debt and deficit, and we're borrowing money. We're going to hurt the kids, your kids in the future, as they try to wrestle with this debt. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go to the opposition side. Member Ellenson, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I want to pick up a little bit on from where my colleague MLA Eremenko left off, and just some of the things that I've heard in the last few minutes. First of all, I'll put out like a shout out for those Albertans that no longer have the ability to purchase insurance for their home. They're now being denied insurance. Their insurance companies have sent them letters and notifications that they can no longer be insured because they have suffered hail damage so many times that the insurance company is no longer willing to cover them. So not all Albertans still have the ability to purchase private insurance. So I wanted to put that shout out there for them. And I want to go back. I think we've just heard in the conversation we're having, and I don't want this to drag on through the whole block or through the whole. We could talk about this for days, not just 6 hours. But how we measure our outcomes and which measures are important, and how is that guiding our decisions. It's a tough line to walk to determine. What's important is are our educational outcomes good? Are our health outcomes good? How are we measuring whether or not our education outcomes are good and whether or not our health outcomes are good? And where do we put the bar as to how good we wanted or what is good enough. And we could compare ourselves to a number of jurisdictions across this country or around the world and still not necessarily have a solid answer of what is good enough. Because when we make that decision of what is good enough, some people are being left out. And some people aren't necessarily getting the services that they would need. So like, as an example, I'll throw in there that like, what is good enough? When it comes to educational assistants and support workers, those kids with disabilities in schools need those services, or they cannot be successful in school or in life, and they need those extra services. So I'm gonna stop there, dial it back to to go back to that measure of appreciating from finance needs its own measures that are beyond what the ministries measure for outcomes. And we've got some of those measures, and we talked about that 5.9 employees per 1,000 population, that we're above Ontario, but that's okay because they have economies of scale. And we're below other provinces. And there are other factors that play there that Alberta, if we were to compare Alberta to BC and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, our population is more spread out. We have more costs associated with the geographical distance between our population than they do in Saskatchewan. And so I guess I'll just ask, like, follow through and give like another kind of like kick at the can for the minister, that this seems more like an output than an outcome. That the minister said, like, we do need to measure what comes out on the other side. And there has to be a point where those other measures, population measures, maybe overcome that need to achieve a number of public employees per 1,000. And how does the minister respond to that?
Well, I'd start and I'd say, if there was a supercomputer that I could pump all this into and it would optimize these decisions for us, we'd use it, but there isn't. So all of it gives us a little bit of information. We get into great detail with each ministry, and then we circle back to the 30,000 foot level and look at the entirety of the province now and going into the future. I think outcomes are the most important, and they cascade in against each other. If you're getting a bad outcome somewhere, it could mean that you're going to have to spend more in a different ministry. So it becomes a very comprehensive conversation. It's messy. It's not perfect, but it all gives you a little bit of information. So I agree that these metrics aren't perfect, but they're just a tool that gives you a little bit more information, and we do the best we can with it.
And those for for everyone to understand that those hard conversations of like running up against those hard conversations may be the suffering of those other outcomes as we run up against the fiscal framework. And then what budgets those other outcomes for the population or the fiscal framework, right? Those are the tough conversations that are had with Albertans. But I'll leave that for a second and maybe continue on a bit of another path. I heard earlier too about a comment about, and following up on some conversations that just happened earlier. Again, the minister was talking about with Member Aramco about infrastructure and about some projects that are in the pipeline but are unable to complete, are going to mean that other projects that could be completed aren't going to start because you've kind of already got things on the go. And should Albertans be prepared for potentially, if there are cost escalations or skill shortages, some announcements that we've already heard that are maybe planning or design? Should Albertans be prepared for those to be punted further down the road if we run into cost escalations or skill shortages?
Well, I don't think that's a new phenomenon. I think that's always been the case somewhat. But yeah, I'd say potentially, and this, I mean it when I say the bigger the plan, the more potential there is for reprofiling. Like the larger it gets, especially with, housing starts, when we're talking, vertical construction, labor ceiling's real. And that's part of why the School Accelerator program is based on, the upper limit of what we think is possible.
And I might come back to the school accelerator program later in the day, because we have like smaller numbers of schools that were announced years ago that have still not broken ground compared to the higher numbers of schools today that are being announced. I'll come back to that later. I want to go back to some of the other like performance metrics that we have, or data that we've got on page 181 of the business plan, in performance indicator 1C, the tax advantage for Alberta. And I'll maybe flip this in a different way. It's estimated that if we were to charge the same kinds of fees and taxes as another province like British Columbia, that we would receive another $20.1 billion in revenue. We've already talked about how tax decisions leave some people no better off. That $20 billion is a lot of money, and it exceeds in the coming estimation for non-renewable resource royalties. And so when we have that conversation about the resource roller coaster, talk to me about the conversation and decisions that you make about looking at other provinces, how they generate revenue, the choices that we made to generate revenue, and whether or not, is there room there so that we would maybe not be in a deficit today?
I think it's a good question. I think you also have to look at everything else that creates in Alberta. The job growth, the highest GDP across the country, the investment, stark investment differences across the country. So I think if you're going to go down that path, you really have to think about it as comprehensively as possible. Taxation's a choice. I say all the time, as complicated as all of this is and messy, it comes down to revenue and expense.
Yeah.
It's what you expect government to pay for and do, and how do you pay for it? And
it's complicated here, even when you think about corporate taxes. We have an outsized share going to one single industry that leads to us having like a supersized GDP. Did we look at when the conversations were had about those 38 items with fee increases and that property tax increase of 14% that now we know is going up by 33% next year, was that drawn from what other provinces do?
33% is 33% of educational operating, which is historically where we were in the past. So we ceded some of that space, even though property taxes continue to increase. I'll let the municipalities explain what they're doing with that money, but we're going back to our historical bar, and I think the investments in education point to the reason for why. What was your question about the other fees?
Those other 38 fees.
Yeah.
Do we look at other provinces to compare like the revenues that they earn and generate?
Interjurisdictional scan on all of them to ensure that we were still below maintaining what advantage we could.
I think with 15 seconds, I should just see the time rather than going into a new topic.
Maybe I'll just take it. So when we talk about the corporate tax rate, so government brought in $7 billion in corporate income tax revenue in 23-24. That is substantially more than that when it was at the previously.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll maybe get back to that. Member Armstrong-Hominick, you have 10 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to the Minister. First of all, Minister, I want to thank you and your amazing team for all the work you do. I can only imagine how challenging your job is, and you do it with grace and with thoughtfulness, so I want to thank you for that. Chair, through you again to the Minister. Performance measure 1D on page 180 of the business plan, it states that the fund's target is to meet or exceed the Canadian Consumer Price Index, plus 450 basis points over a rolling 5-year period. Minister, Chair, through you to the Minister, can you quantify this as a return percentage? Also, this measure mentions in 23-24 it returned a rate of return of 6.4%. If that is accurate, why are we budgeting for only a 4.5 rate return over the next 3 years, given the objective to maximize earnings in objective 1.2?
Okay, good question. Thank you, Emily Hominick. So I'll break it down a little bit. So the Heritage Savings Trust Fund has a real return target equal to Canadian Consumer Price Index, CPI, plus 4.5%, measured over 5-year rolling period. So for the latest 5-year period ending December 31st, 2024, and this would have been reported budget tabling day, February 27th, the Heritage Fund returned 7.0%, 7%, which was 0.3% lower than the real return target of 7.3%. So performance is measured over the long term to capture changes in economic cycles. There may be times when long-term performance is higher or lower than the target. The Heritage Fund's real return target is used to evaluate the investment direction given to the fund, which includes items such as the fund's asset allocation, investment manager selection, and risk measures. The fund's investment policy states that the real return target of the Heritage Fund is an average return of 4.5% adjusted for inflation, based on the Consumer Price Index, which is a measure of domestic inflation. So by nature, this target is almost always positive and encourages investment decisions that contribute to positive long-term growth. If the target is not being achieved, it serves as a signal for the asset owner, that's us, to reassess the existing strategic asset allocation and seek out potential improvements. At the end of last fiscal year, the Heritage Fund achieved a 5-year net rate of return of 6.4% versus a real return target of 7%. In this case, the real return target of 7% was comprised of a 2.5% CPI measure for the 5-year period, plus the fixed 4.5% excess performance target. So the 2.5 plus the 4.5 gets you at the 7.
Okay, thank you. Chair, through you to the Minister. Outcome 2 on page 182 of the business plan states policy and regulatory oversight for the financial, securities, insurance, and pension sectors is effective, fair, and in the interest of Albertans. Minister, can you explain how your reforms to the insurance industry, moving to a first care model, will ultimately be in the best interest of Albertans moving forward? And Minister, also, can you give us some ideas? What is the regulatory oversight and what it will look like going forward?
Okay, no, thanks for the question. This is a very complicated and challenging file, and system change is always challenging. So we are excited about what we're doing. Shifting to a new Care First system will provide injured Albertans with better medical, rehabilitation, and income support benefits. For example, today, the medical and rehabilitation benefits currently available to injured Albertans is limited to medically necessary expenses up to $50,000 for 2 years following a collision. Under Care First, this will increase to potentially unlimited amounts over the entirety of their lifetime. Additionally, the Care First model will shift focus away from court battles and instead will be centered on meaningfully supporting an Albertan's recovery. Instead of navigating lengthy legal processes, Albertans would have access to the medical care, rehabilitation, and support they need when they need it most. This would allow Albertans to focus on getting better and back to work, not on litigation. Second part of your question on the regulatory oversight, the regulatory model under Care First will largely exist as it does today. More specifically, the Office of the Superintendent of Insurance will continue to regulate the conduct of insurance companies operating in Alberta. Compliance activities undertaken by the superintendent ensure that insurance companies treat Albertans fairly. In the next 2 years, up to 11 staff will be hired to support additional regulatory and compliance activities of the Care First program on an ongoing basis. The Automobile Insurance Rate Board, which is established by the Ministry of Finance as an independent agency and overseen by an independent board, delivers efficient rate regulation for automobile insurance companies and educates Albertans about the insurance marketplace. Up to an additional 13 staff members will be hired to support that program. Finally, the Alberta Insurance Council is an industry-funded regulator that licenses and oversees agents, brokers, and independent adjusters operating in Alberta. Details of potential changes to help further bolster the automobile insurance regulatory landscape to help support the Care First model are anticipated as part of upcoming legislation later this spring.
Thank you, Minister, and also Chair, through you again to the Minister. I want to speak on outcome 3 on page 183 of the Ministry Business Plan. This outcome states that public servants are getting Albertan services when and where they need it. As our caucus has numerous rural MLAs, this is good to hear, but I have to ask, how in a time of fiscal restraint can we ensure that this outcome remains applicable when it may be obvious cost savings to close some of these services in rural Alberta? And Minister, also, Chair, through you to the Minister, outcome 3 also goes on to state that government has a professional, nonpartisan, and engaged public service that proudly serves Albertans. Now, this is a laudable goal, but given that what we have seen at federal levels, both here and in the South, it's been quite clear that often it seems that some, and by all means, I emphasize it's only some, in the public service appear to work at odds at what is best interest of the citizens. So I guess my question is, how do we ensure that the public service does indeed remain nonpartisan and does not actively push an agenda not in concert with government?
Interesting. Well, I can speak for the public servants I have beside me that they always act in a very, nonpartisan, pragmatic way, give me the best advice that they can. And it's very thoughtful and well thought out in the sense that I think the majority of the public sector that I see and deal with, still believe in fearless advice and loyal implementation, and it's puts the onus back on me to be a practical, thoughtful person and take the best advice available and move forward. When it comes to how this, public service and your question about decisions and implications in rural Alberta, I think that's all part of a perspective that you need to have at different levels. We need it within the ministries. We need it within Treasury Board and Finance. The province is big. It has facilities and services everywhere. You have to measure some of those things differently. You have to measure the outcomes on the ground differently. For example, my time in agriculture, Chair, there's a lot of conversations around AFSC's offices, for example, where they were. There've been changes in location, and so you just have to proceed thoughtfully. The world is changing, technology is changing. The need in some instances for brick and mortar facilities, and our demographics change as well. The people that rely on those services in that way, that changes over time too. So it's part of an ongoing process that you have to look at, and look at different metrics like how many people are through the door in a week. What is the alternative? What does that look like? And then is that something we can support in a different way? So I think it's messy, and it's at a high level, and it's within the ministries, and it's part of a conversation that we all have to keep having.
Thank you very much, Minister. Member Ellington, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, I'd like to return a little bit to the educational property taxes for a moment, in those increases. So it is like 14% is the increase year over year. And I know that, I live in a municipality where people get a little agitated around property taxes. And they get a little agitated on their property taxes if their city portion of their property taxes goes up by 3%. And you're proposing an increase that is, 5 times that. I think we're understating just how much these property taxes are going to affect people, how much they're going to feel it. So just again, the choice to, such an outsized, increase for this particular tax. Why are we kind of putting it in that one bucket?
Well, I guess I would point to the fact that we thought it prudent to stage it over 2 years. You can imagine how dramatic it would be to do it all at once. We do, feel strongly that, all things combined, bringing in the income tax cut, bringing in that affordability measure, which impacts 2 million Albertans. We can debate over who's seeing the impact more than others, but there's very few programs that I can think of that you'd be able to touch that many Albertans. But point back to our education requirements. 505 million in operating, capital plan that's being dominated by schools, which we all support. But the schools will predominantly be in high growth areas too. That's another consideration. So, housing values are changing, and that is an average. So you got to look at what it means for the individual.
And I do remember the time my dad was a municipal councillor many years ago, when the government made the choice to harmonize the mill rate for the educational property tax across jurisdictions, because it used to be differentiated between municipalities, and some municipalities were punished in paying a higher mill rate in order to try and generate the needs for that area. So that's going back in time. This question or statement might actually give you a little bit of credit. Maybe I'm misinterpreting. On page 57 of the fiscal plan, I see that the increased revenues over Q3 forecast will be 392 million through the educational property tax. But then when I look on page 68 of the fiscal plan, the overall increases to education is 426 million. And so I'm wondering whether or not you're actually getting closer to that goal of you want to move from 28% to 31% to then 33% of the total costs being covered. Are we actually getting closer to that goal? It feels like we're just kind of treading water.
Well, so my deputy was just giving me a little context that's maybe important for this. So it's once again that there's a challenge there between the calendar year and the fiscal year as well, which throws those off a little bit. But yeah, the education spend is still gonna far outweigh the education property tax component.
So I'll ask a little bit maybe to get some clarification. You talked about how those educational expenses, the capital expenses, will be going mostly to those areas that are showing the highest population growth, where the most number of students are coming in. And so I'm wondering if you have any data, or if you can share any data of the educational property tax lift. How much would come from, say, Calgary? And how much of those educational, the overall, how much of that capital spend do you think will be in the Calgary catchment area, the Calgary Board of Education and Calgary Catholic District?
I think we'd have to go to municipal affairs for that data. And education. Yeah.
Okay, I appreciate that. We can pick up. We can find other ways to ask education and municipal affairs about that.
You are right about the population.
I know. I live in a constituency where 3 years ago I would look out my window and see empty fields, and now I see acres and acres of houses. So it is. But I also have full appreciation for those other areas of the province that may not be growing as quickly. They also desperately need infrastructure improvements, no question about it. I want to talk a little bit about, I think this is also a thread that we brought up earlier, with our ability to keep up with infrastructure. We noted that in September, the $8.6 billion school accelerator program announcement. And at that time, we did say that this was a generational investment, and gave credit to that announcement. At the time, it was noted that the accelerator program would allow announcements to happen between budgets, that in the middle of the year we could see some things, but then we didn't actually hear anything until a week before budget. And so I'm wondering whether or not in those first 6 months, whether or not we actually were able to do what we said we would do and make announcements in between budgets.
So we did some approvals, within the year, some design bill. I'd have to get you the actual schools. Maybe you should do a better job communicating that throughout the year. But really, maybe for everybody's understanding on the school accelerator program and the commitment that, this government's making for all of our understanding is that it really is allowing the Minister of Education to come to us, as opposed to bottlenecking the process all in 1 month at budget, and being able to say, okay, we're gonna build 30 schools. If they meet our stage gate criteria, which is very important, if they can, turn our chart from red to green and show us that the site servicing is there, that all of the considerations have been made that would slow down the potential for construction, and it meets the need requirements around population growth, we will approve it in year. And so you can imagine how dramatic that will be for the end date of when these construction projects will be done by allowing them to be accelerated in that sense. It's still an onus on municipalities to have the site servicing ready. I'm not pushing the Minister of Education to say, hey, bring me more. He's pushing the municipalities to say, if you want School X done, we need this checklist completed so you can bring it to us. But that's really the process. And it should be understood how much that hampers my job to balance the budget.
And I appreciate, I think you've just answered my next two questions also. One in the role of the ministry in approving those projects as they kind of like move through, right? So you've just talked about like your framework where you make the decision of it flipping from red to green to kind of unleash the funds, right? Like that's where your role is, that it's up to municipalities and the Ministry of Education to be doing that work before that gets to you. And you did talk about how, you're not going to go hounding them. It's up to them to come to you. But this is an accelerated program. $8.6 billion was announced in September, $2.6 billion for this budget. Will you hound them if you find that the projects aren't coming to you to flip from red to green and you think that we're falling behind on that commitment? Is that a role that you have?
Yeah, I think so. I don't foresee that being a problem. I honestly don't. But yeah, we would have questions. Really what we've said is to the Minister of Education, we'll have a Treasury Board meeting a month if you have schools that require approval. It's not something we offer to anyone else. But if we're getting through the year and he hasn't brought anything forward, we'll definitely ask some questions, and I'm sure infrastructure will as well.
Okay, and I'll ask a question and I'm going to see if I get to the end of the question and answer it later. So we already have projects that are in the pipeline. So I'll use an example in the constituency of Calgary Foothills in the budget of 23-24. Full construction funding was for an elementary school for Calgary Catholic in Nolan Hill. It's 2 years now has passed. There's no shovel in the ground. There's still no real information from the Minister of Infrastructure about when that project will actually move forward, and we can see, they said maybe this summer. So we have projects that are there. Is it also like a role of yours to kind of go to the Ministry of Infrastructure and say, what's taking so long? I approved that money 2 years ago.
Okay, thank you. We'll maybe get back to that next block. Member Boychenko, you have 10 minutes. Go ahead.
Right. Thank you, Chair. Before I start with my questions, I would like to thank and acknowledge and appreciate the public servants and the great, amazing team you have, Minister. A special shout out to Kate White, who's actually putting her heart into this budget, and I appreciate working with you on the Treasury Board, and it's amazing to see how hard team works to balance this budget. Being on the Treasury Board, I can attest to how hard Minister is trying to balance the budget, and I can just tell you that I don't think we sell enough oil and gas in this province, because if we do, then we can pay for our education, health, all these social programs that we have, and much, much more, without putting tax on the people and maybe perhaps even charging less taxes. When it comes to the deficit that we have in this year, I can say that we couldn't ask for a better minister, especially with your personality, calm and collective to be able to weather this storm. So thank you for your leadership there. And we truly appreciate your conservative approach to the budget. It's rather be conservative than stick our neck out and then, be surprised and caught by surprise at the end of the day. So thank you for being conservative. I want to talk a little bit about personal income tax because we've heard from the member opposite that some people have a hard time paying taxes. And I think that I've never seen anybody saying that I love my taxes and I'm happy with my taxes. We all want to pay less taxes. Despite the challenges that we have in the budget, we still manage to reduce personal income tax. So it's amazing how that can be done, this budget. So thank you for trying. So I start with my question, obviously through the chair to the minister. On page 249 of the government estimate, the minister shows that the revenue from personal income tax is decreasing, as has been talked about extensively. Our government has taken the course of action to reduce personal income tax for all Albertans, saving each individuals about $750 per year, which to those of us, it's amazing, what $750 can do. And for my constituents, this will allow them to put more money into groceries, home heating, pay for mortgages or rents, and fuel our vehicles. So to the minister, through the chair, do Albertans pay lower personal income tax than the rest of Canada? And what is the second lowest province? And how will we keep personal income tax lower going forward?
No, thank you for the question and your kind remarks at the start. That was very nice, Emily Bachenko. So we're obviously committed to keeping taxes low for Albertans. We want to allow Albertans to keep more of their hard-earned dollars in their pockets to deal with their daily lives. We strengthened this commitment through the 2023 amendments to the Alberta Taxpayer Protection Act, which prevents government from increasing income taxes without first consulting Albertans through a referendum. Some provinces may have lower personal income taxes, but once you include Alberta's lack of a sales tax, lack of payroll tax, as well as low fuel tax, Albertans will generally pay less tax in Alberta than they would in any other province. And when you combine all of the taxes together, as we've discussed, it's a $20.1 billion delta over the next closest province. The new tax bracket further entrenches Alberta's tax advantage. A working Albertan with no children earning $75,000 will now pay about $2,100 less than in British Columbia. The second lowest province, which is the second lowest province, compared to $1,400 less than before the introduction of the tax cut. A two-income couple with two children earning $150,000 now pays nearly $3,000 less tax in Alberta than in British Columbia, compared to nearly $1,800 before the tax cut. So those examples would give you some reference points.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Alberta's already have lowest tax across Canada. So my next question would be, why did we decide to lower it even more? And how will that help the most vulnerable, and how will that benefit the province?
No, it's a good question. So, we know, Premier Smith campaigned on this income tax cut promise. And it's been something, we've been wrestling with, how to bring it forward and when. I as I said earlier, I was struggling with the timing in the sense that I did want to see population settle out, have more people tethered to the job market, just to respond to the pressures we're seeing on the expense side. But when everything's considered, with the uncertainty that we have around tariffs, government's inability, there's in no way do we have near the fiscal capacity or dry powder to keep people whole through something like this. So it's very important that we do something. So I think the income tax cut is well warranted to do now, to give that to Albertans while we move forward. And I know that's been referenced in many of the quotes from the rating agencies. I believe it was Moody's that referenced the income tax cut specifically as a prudent tool to allow Albertans to weather the storm of this tariff uncertainty. So I guess keeping our promises. It does impact 2 million Albertans. It's dramatic in the way that it will do that, but we think it's good policy. I know I've been asked around should we decrease the small business tax rate from 2% to 0, and I think everything considered, having the productivity summit, some of these things. We think that's bad policy. We think that's going the wrong way. We're creating kind of a tax cliff that incentivizes businesses to stay small. That's already part of our productivity challenge in Canada. So we think this provides some help in an uncertain time. And like I said before, we're all very confident that Alberta is going to come out the other end of this stronger than ever, with everything we're seeing across the country, markets, egress, interprovincial trade barriers dropping. But we just have to do what we can to help Albertans weather it. And it'll be more challenging for some, no doubt.
Thank you. I would like to also bring our attention a little bit to the corporate tax that's been lower. NDP introduced 12% corporate tax, and our government has lowered it to 8%. We've talked about it a little bit, but maybe you can highlight the biggest benefits of the lowering of tax, if that increase our total budget or is decrease, and what is the benefit of lowering that corporate tax and being the lowest?
Yeah, we have brought in more corporate tax at a lower rate. Large portion of that is from the oil and gas sector, no doubt. But yeah, I think it speaks to the philosophy of are you better off charging less and growing the pie? Do you want the job growth and creation that comes with it, or do you want to risk interjurisdictional uncompetitiveness and see flight of capital and everything that comes with it? We've been through that in this province not that long ago either. So I think we're comfortable, leaning on our broad-based, competitive structure. One of the challenges for the province going forward is that you have to, if that's going to be your sales pitch, then you have to stick to it. You can't add a bunch of other things on the sides. You got to stick to this is going to be our competitive advantage, and that's what we'll rely on to bring people here.
Thank you very much. Member Ellingson, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of comments. There's this, term in economics that I, came to love. I think it's very convenient for economists. Ceteris paribus, all else being equal. And so that increase in corporate taxes is not just to do with the tax rate. There are so many other things happening that would lead to corporate tax collection going up or down. In our case, just moving from prepayment to post-payment for giant industrial oil sands facilities. And so just wanted to put that out there. And we can debate another time about the small business tax. I think what's very interesting, that understanding that that maybe provides a disincentive for businesses to grow, that they want to stay in that lower tax rate. If we applied that to people, then we would also make the assumption that people want to keep their personal incomes below a certain rate so that they don't pay more. And I don't know whether or not that's actually the case, but we won't debate that today. So,
not to interrupt, Court, but you do, it also brings up an interesting point of these cliffs. You also have to watch them on the program side, because you can create a lot of,
yeah, there's a tipping
outcomes,
point, right? There's a tipping
welfare
point.
walls,
Yeah.
and
There's a tipping point. I will agree to that. I think I left off with a question, and just to cycle back to that question, the projects that have been out there, what's the role of the ministry to kind of prod, I guess in this case it would be infrastructure, to move those projects ahead?
No, and I'm glad we're coming back to that. So we work closely with the Ministry of Infrastructure to get through what I would call our stage-gated process. So hopefully that project doesn't have a simple fix hang up, the field that you're staring at that hasn't become a school. Hopefully it isn't something as simple as servicing, or it shouldn't have been in the budget to begin with. So we want to make sure that we're comfortable with what infrastructure has shown us, that the light turns from red to green before it moves forward. And that's part of the tools we rely on to ensure that we don't have delays further down the road. But we constantly are in conversation with infrastructure and education when it comes to schools, and do keep track of delays.
I will, so in that case, I'll use this as a segue to keep kind of going on this topic. The note that was received back from infrastructure was that P3 negotiations are still underway. Last year, Member Phillips asked about in the fiscal plan, and your response was that 7 out of 43 school projects were proceeding as a P3. And so I'll ask, like, how many of the school projects that have been announced, like, since then, are also proceeding as a P3?
We would have to dig that up, Court. I don't have that here, but I think we can find that.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. One thing that I'd say, one thing that's a concern potentially that we have to look at is with all this risk and uncertainty, if a P3 potentially is going to bring that risk from the potential future into real time for us. So we're going to watch P3s closely when it comes to tariff uncertainty. Is that pricing being front loaded in these deals? So the value for money calculation is going to be extremely important.
So it seems today you're being a bit prescient because you're answering my next questions.
Oh.
So I did because I did want to ask about those P3s. Like, so in this case, in that example that I gave about the Nolan Hill Catholic School, where the perception is that P3 is maybe slowing it down. And that by slowing it down in those negotiations, in that P3 as an example, who's on the hook for cost increases if the project takes longer to deliver than we think it would, and how are we mitigating those risks?
We usually protect our liability well on the overspend. It's usually the builder. I'd have to get a little more detail for this project specifically to understand it. We obviously don't have that, but the value for money calculation is key, and it only works if it's on the timeline as presented. So the delays are on the builder.
And in a P3 scenario, there's no way that those delays or costs could in any way be transferred back to the school board.
Okay, if the contract were to become invalid, force majeure situation.
Understanding that would be an exceptional situation. But should that eventuality come, is there protection for the school board?
The government?
Okay, so at the end of the day, worst case scenario, the government is the backstop.
Yeah, we're always on the hook, it seems. Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification. So now I want to talk a little bit, and as a segue, the purpose of increasing those educational property taxes is for that source of revenue to come closer to the overall expense of education. I'll call it investment instead of expense. And there are other examples, like I talked about earlier, that increase in fee for the Alberta Immigration Program. That last year, one of those reasons too was like for the ministry to come a little bit closer in cost recovery. In last year's estimates, that was one of your responses, was to come closer to cost recovery. And so I'm going to jump into another ministry, a big ministry, and this is an area of concern for Albertans, that we're not going to start to look to cost recovery for healthcare. Can the minister commit that we haven't seen it in this budget, but that in the future budgets, we will not see the introduction of healthcare premiums as a way to cost recover the costs of delivering healthcare to Albertans?
So just before I go to there, this might shine a little light on your previous question. I think it was on the immigration application fee.
Yes.
So part of the scan we did, so the proposal was from 840 to 1,400. BC, for example, is 1,475. Ontario is between 1,500 and 2,000, and the Government of Canada's fee is 15 1/4. So that's
you're kind of right there in the mix.
Some of the analysis that we would have looked at. Your question about healthcare premium, like I'm certainly not going to tie the hands of a future finance minister, but I would say anything that dramatic would certainly have to be, consulted with Albertans. If that's.
I mean, you might be the finance minister again next year, inshallah.
Point of order?
So my point of order is the 23B. I honestly, it speaks to matters other than the question at hand. We're talking about the current estimates, not speculation on future estimates. I think that this would be considered as a point of order in terms of 23B.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just note that the budget documents do look forward 3 years. All of the fiscal plans, the budget documents are not just limited to forecasts for this upcoming fiscal year, but future years as well. And it seems that the minister does not seem to have any concerns about answering these questions.
Okay, if we can keep it as close as we can, you're doing a great job, but if we just keep it on track here.
And I'll actually close that topic in understanding that we can't make a commitment today. That no healthcare premiums would be introduced. So
there's no healthcare premium that's part of the 3-year plan.
Another healthcare question, and this is we've seen in recent media articles, the tobacco settlement. And we did actually, I'll link it back, we actually had an article of legislation that we passed that brought us, this province, in line with other provinces in the feds on that tobacco settlement. The settlement will be substantial. Maybe can the minister clarify whether or not any of those funds would be included anywhere that I wasn't able to identify any potential funds coming from that settlement that would be reflected in this budget?
No, it's a good question, and it's still there's a lot of unknowns. I know in speaking with the controller, Dan Stowweiser, and conversations he's having, a lot of provinces are trying to determine how to account for this, and then how likely it is that the actual payments will continue. So there's a lot of considerations being had to how that will be, reported and brought in. But the number, like if you want to know the number, I think our expectation was that Alberta's share was maybe 4.1 billion, but that's over 20 years. So it would mean a substantial amount in the first year, and then no, the number that's in my head is 750 million, but I should look behind and see.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. Okay, Member Boychenko, you have 5.5 minutes. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you very much, sir. I want to take our attention a little bit back to AIMCO. We all see that investment management charges outlined on page 249 under revenue, bringing significant revenue that is then offset in the expenses. We all know that the fall, you have fired the board of AIMCO along with CEO and several actually other executive members. We also then had appointed Right Honorable Stephen Harper, former amazing Prime Minister of Canada, as the board chair. And with that, changes that were happening in the AIMCO, I want to see if we achieve the outcome we were looking for. So I'll probably give you two questions at the same time here. If you can tell us why that was necessary to do going on to the 25-26 reporting period, and as well as if we see any positive changes and savings in our 2025 or going on 2026 budget. So if you can just kindly, high level give us, why that was necessary and what we're expecting to change with the new board and hopefully new charges and costs associated with this.
Sure, thanks for the question. So our concern was around, rising costs from our perspective without, correlating change in return and the trajectory that was on. I guess I'd say in the short term, we've seen some of the moves made by the new CEO and board around focusing on priorities of investment returns. They have done some downsizing, but not on investment focused personnel. Also been some changes in their footprint. They closed the New York and Singapore offices and have moved some folks back to Calgary and Edmonton. So I think it just shows they're marching into the challenge that we've gave them and have made some initial moves that I think should be appreciated by all of the asset owners, including us with the Heritage Fund, but also the pensions. And it'll be a ongoing, work in progress. And I think it's, like government too, things just grow if they're allowed to. And I think you constantly will see that things need, a reset and a refocus, and just remind who they work for and why, and ensure that that's the mandate that they're given and acting on. But so far, I've been appreciative of the relationship. I'd say Mr. Harper's exceptional board chair, from what I've seen, is very dedicated to the province and wants to see this through. It's a way of kind of giving back to the province. So I think we all should be lucky to have him.
Thank you. Also, you had mentioned about Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund, and I absolutely love the idea of growing it from $25 billion to $250 billion, and I hope that the next governments can take it even further to maybe even $500 billion, because I think the future in the planet are the trust funds, because this is constant, stream of funding. So with the new board, if you can maybe in the last minute here give us maybe your desire to see the changes and maybe benefits to the Alberta Heritage and Savings Trust Fund, and maybe even the pension plan as well.
Well, I'd say the most important thing is you have to have a statement of investment priorities and goals, the marching order to your investment manager that's appropriate for what you want to achieve. So when we changed the default setting from the Heritage Fund just being inflation proof to saying that we were going to leave the retained earnings and we want growth to 2050, a very patient, growth oriented plan. We have to ensure that that's the direction that we're giving the manager to invest on our behalf. So that's part of the process that we're in now. I agree with you. I think it's been too long, used for general revenue.
Thank you very much. Apologize for the interruption, but I must advise committee that the time allotted for this portion of the considerations ministry estimates has concluded. We will complete the last 4.5 minutes of that block when we meet this afternoon. So I'd like to remind committee members that we are scheduled to meet this afternoon at 3:30 to consider considerations of the estimates of Treasury Board and Finance. Thank you, everyone. This meeting is adjourned.